Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Story 1. It began with a single knock at the door. One soft, deliberate thud that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Maya jolted upright in her bed, her heart pounding against her rib cage. It wasn't the knock that scared her, it was the fact that she lived alone. For a moment she convinced herself it was a dream, but then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks this time. Each one felt heavier than the last. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she checked the time. 3:17 a.m. No one should be knocking at her door at this hour. Maya sat frozen, the darkness around her suddenly oppressive, the shadows in the corners of her room feeling alive. She wanted to believe it was just a prank, some neighborhood kid messing around. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Who was outside? And what did they want? The knocks stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. But just as she began to calm herself, a whisper, barely audible, slithered through the cracks of her door. It wasn't her name. It wasn't any word she could understand. But it was there, unmistakable. Heart racing, she tiptoed toward the door. Her every instinct screamed at her to stay away, but curiosity and fear pulled her closer. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. No street lights, no porch light, not even the faint outline of a figure. But then, the breathing began. The room was drowning in a suffocating stillness, broken only by Maya's shallow, panicked breaths. Her mind raced as she clutched the lamp, her only weapon against an enemy she couldn't even see. She didn't dare move. The knock had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. She stared at the door, willing herself not to blink, not to miss a single movement. Her phone buzzed again. The vibration was loud in the silence, and it made her jump. She stared at the screen, afraid to read the message but knowing she had no choice. They can smell fear. Maya's throat went dry. Her grip on the lamp tightened. Was this some kind of sick joke? But how could anyone know what was happening inside her house? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. Finally, she typed, "Who are you? What do they want?" The reply came instantly. "You need to leave. Now, leave." How could she leave when whatever was out there, or in here, was waiting for her? The thought of stepping out into the darkness was more terrifying than staying where she was. Her thoughts were interrupted by a new sound, a faint scratching coming from the door. It wasn't like nails against wood, it was softer, like something wet. Her stomach churned at the sound, and she took an involuntary step back. Then came the voice, low, guttural, and completely unnatural. Maya? It wasn't just calling her name, it was mimicking it, twisting it into something almost unrecognizable. The sound sent chills racing down her spine. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Don't answer it. Whatever happens, don't speak to them. Her heart pounded as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. The thing on the other side of the door was no longer trying to be subtle. It wanted her to know it was there. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. Maya waited, her muscles tense, her breath caught in her throat. Seconds stretched into minutes, and still nothing happened. Slowly, cautiously, she moved closer to the door, pressing her ear against it to listen. Nothing. For a brief moment she thought it might be over. Maybe whatever was out there had given up. She let out a shaky breath, her body relaxing just a fraction. And then the whisper came, right by her ear, as if it were inside the room with her. "Let me in." She stumbled backward, dropping the lamp. The bulb shattered on the floor, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to grab her phone, its screen casting a faint glow in the pitch-black room. Her hand shook as she dialed 911. The call connected, but all she heard on the other end was static. And beneath the static, a voice, low and distorted. "Maya, they're coming." She threw the phone onto the bed, her chest heaving. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. She pinched herself hard, but the pain only confirmed what she already knew. This was happening. Maya's gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape. The window? No, it was too high up. The closet? It wouldn't be safe for long. Her options were running out. The phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she had no choice. The message read, "Look under the bed." Her blood ran cold. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The very idea of checking under the bed was unthinkable. But the thought of ignoring the message was worse. Slowly, her hands trembling, she lowered herself to the floor. The faint glow of her phone illuminated the space beneath the bed. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. And then, a hand. Pale, with fingers impossibly long, it rested on the floor, completely still. Maya clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle her scream as she scrambled backward, her heart threatening to burst out of her chest. The hand didn't move. It just stayed there, lifeless and horrifying. Her phone buzzed again, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. She glanced at the screen. It's not alone. Tears streamed down her face as she backed into the corner of the room, her body trembling. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The hand under the bed slowly withdrew, disappearing into the darkness. But before she could even begin to process what she'd seen, a new sound filled the room, a low, wet gurgling noise coming from the ceiling. Her eyes shot upward, and what she saw would haunt her forever. A figure clung to the ceiling, its body twisted and contorted, its head cocked at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scream. Maya couldn't hold it in any longer. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the house. As her scream died out, the creature dropped from the ceiling, landing with a sickening thud. Maya didn't wait to see what it would do next. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. The house was no longer familiar. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. Every door she passed felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. She reached the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock. It wouldn't budge. She pulled and twisted, her desperation mounting as the footsteps grew louder. Her phone buzzed one last time. She glanced at the screen, her vision blurred by tears. "Don't run. They like it when you run." Maya's breath hitched as she read the message on her phone. "Don't run. They like it when you run." The words lingered in her mind, but she couldn't stop herself. Her body was in full panic mode, every instinct screaming at her to get out. The creature's footsteps grew louder, heavier, like it was toying with her, letting her know it was never far behind. "Come on," she whispered through gritted teeth, her hands desperately yanking at the lock on the front door. It still wouldn't move, as though the house itself had turned against her. The air behind her shifted, heavy and cold, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel it, the thing, standing just a few feet away. Watching. "Maya?" The voice was guttural and sing-song like a child's twisted lullaby. Her fingers finally found the lock's sweet spot, and the door creaked open. Without thinking, she bolted outside, slamming the door behind her. She stumbled onto the porch, her bare feet hitting the icy ground. For a moment, she thought she was safe. The crisp night air filled her lungs, replacing the suffocating dread of the house. But then she realized the street was wrong. The houses around her were all dark, their windows shattered or boarded up. The street lights flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, no distant hum of cars. It was like the world had been swallowed by a void. Her phone buzzed again. She looked down at the screen, her hands trembling. "You didn't leave. You just stepped further in." Her heart sank. She looked back at the house, but it wasn't there anymore. In its place was a black, towering structure, its edges jagged and unnatural, as if it had been carved out of the night itself. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't escaped. She'd gone deeper into whatever nightmare this was. She turned back to the street, her eyes scanning for any sign of life. There had to be someone, anyone, who could help her. But as she walked, the shadows seemed to close in, the street narrowing with every step. Her phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. "Look up." Her stomach churned, but she couldn't ignore it. Slowly she tilted her head. Above her the sky was wrong. The stars were gone, replaced by swirling shapes, faces, dozens of them, their mouths open in silent screams. They stared down at her, unblinking, their expressions frozen in agony. A chill ran through her, and she forced herself to look away. She started walking faster, her bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she couldn't stay still. The shadows began to move, slithering along the ground like living things. They seemed to follow her, their shapes shifting and twisting into forms she didn't want to recognize. "Help!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the empty street. "Someone please help me." Her voice was met with silence. But then, from somewhere ahead, a faint light flickered. It was a street lamp, glowing faintly at the end of the road. Beneath it stood a figure, a man, tall and motionless, his face obscured by the shadows. Maya hesitated. Every instinct told her to stay away, but what choice did she have? She couldn't go back, and staying where she was felt like a death sentence. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying her. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't trust him." She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The man took a step forward, and she instinctively stepped back. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed behind her. Maya's blood ran cold. She didn't want to look, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly she turned her head. The shadows had gathered into a single mass, a towering, writhing figure that loomed over her. It had no face, no discernible features, just an endless void of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The man under the street lamp spoke at last, his voice low and gravelly. "Run." She didn't need to be told twice. Maya turned and sprinted, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. The pavement beneath her feet felt wrong, soft and sticky, as if the ground itself were trying to hold her back. The shadow thing roared, a deafening sound that shook the air around her. It moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them with ease. Maya's lungs burned as she ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't dare look back. She just focused on the road ahead, willing herself to keep going. The man's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Don't let it catch you." She didn't know where she was running to. There was no end in sight, no sign of safety. The street seemed to stretch on forever, an endless loop of flickering lights and abandoned houses. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't stop to look. She couldn't afford to slow down. Finally she saw something, a door standing in the middle of the road. It was completely out of place, its frame surrounded by nothing but darkness. Her phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at the screen. "Go through the door. It's your only chance." She didn't have time to question it. The shadow thing was right behind her, its presence suffocating. She lunged for the door, her hand grasping the cold metal of the doorknob. She twisted it and threw the door open, stumbling through to the other side. The world changed instantly. She was no longer on the street. Instead, she found herself in a dimly lit room, its walls lined with mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, but something was off. The reflections didn't move the way she did. They were a split second behind, their movements jerky and unnatural. Her phone buzzed one final time. The message read, "Don't trust your reflection." Maya stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by reflections that felt wrong. The air was suffocatingly still, and her own distorted image stared back at her from every direction. The longer she looked, the more the mirrors seemed to shift, subtle at first but undeniable. Her reflection smiled. Maya wasn't smiling. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection tilted its head, studying her like prey. Its eyes gleamed with something sinister, something alive. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't dare take her eyes off the mirrors. She fumbled for the phone, pulling it out with trembling hands. The message on the screen read, "Do not break the glass." Her heart sank. The thought hadn't even crossed her mind, but now it was all she could think about. The urge to shatter the mirrors, to destroy the thing mocking her from the other side, was almost overwhelming. The reflection's smile widened, its lips curling unnaturally, exposing teeth that were far too sharp. Slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Maya's stomach churned as she watched her own distorted twin, its fingers too long, its nails blackened and jagged. Then it spoke. "Maya," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, vibrating through the room like a faint echo. "Come closer." She shook her head, her legs trembling. "No, you're not me." The reflection chuckled, a sound that sent chills racing down her spine. "Not yet." Behind her, another voice whispered, "Don't look away." Maya whipped around, but there was nothing there, just more mirrors. More twisted versions of herself, each more grotesque than the last. One had empty eye sockets, black voids where its eyes should have been. Another was drenched in blood, its face contorted in a permanent scream. Her head spun. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of horrors, each reflection pulling her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her phone buzzed again. She forced herself to look at the screen. "You're not alone in there." Her breath hitched. She turned back to the mirrors, her eyes darting from one reflection to the next. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. Her own image blended with the twisted versions, each one watching her, waiting. The floor beneath her creaked. She froze. The sound hadn't come from her. Slowly, she lowered her gaze to the ground. The faint outline of a shadow stretched across the floor, moving closer to her with each passing second. Her heart pounded as she took a step back, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the shadow. But there was nothing, just mirrors and the oppressive darkness. The shadow stopped, and then it rose. The darkness seemed to peel away from the floor, taking form as a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its head was featureless, save for two glowing white eyes that stared directly at her. Maya's legs gave out and she collapsed to the floor, scrambling backward on her hands and knees. The creature didn't move. It just stood there watching her. Her phone buzzed again, the sound piercing the silence. She fumbled for it, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Don't let it touch you." The creature tilted its head as if reading the message over her shoulder. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and for the first time, it took a step forward. "No," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay back." It didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet, her back pressing against one of the mirrors. The glass was cold against her skin, and she could feel her reflection moving independently behind her. The creature took another step, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring the moment. Maya's mind raced. She had nowhere to run. The mirrors surrounded her, trapping her in a nightmare with no escape. And then one of the reflections spoke. "Let it in." Her head snapped toward the mirror. It was her own voice, but it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the reflection, the one with the empty eye sockets. "Let it in," the reflection repeated, its voice dripping with malice. "No," Maya screamed, her hands flying to her ears. "Leave me alone." The mirrors around her began to ripple, as though the glass had turned to water. The reflections grew more distorted, their faces twisting and merging until they were unrecognizable. The creature was only a few feet away now, its long fingers reaching out toward her. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she had no choice. The message read, "There's only one way out." Maya's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help her. But there was nothing but mirrors and a towering figure that was now only an arm's length away. Her mind flashed back to the message, "Do not break the glass." But what if that was the way out? What if the only way to escape this nightmare was to do the one thing she'd been told not to? The creature's fingers brushed against her shoulder, and a searing pain shot through her body. She screamed, the sound raw and desperate, as the room seemed to tilt and spin around her. "Break it," one of the reflections hissed. "No," another shouted. "Don't listen to them." Maya's head felt like it was splitting in two, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The creature's grip tightened, and she felt her strength slipping away. She had to do something, anything. With a surge of adrenaline, she spun around and slammed her fist into the nearest mirror. The glass shattered instantly, shards flying in every direction. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body writhing as though in agony. The reflections in the other mirrors began to crack and splinter, their twisted faces screaming silently as the glass fractured. Maya stumbled backward, her hand bleeding from the impact. The room was collapsing around her, the mirrors disintegrating into nothingness. The creature's eyes burned brighter, its form flickering like a dying flame. And then, with one final ear-piercing scream, it vanished. Maya fell to her knees, her body trembling. The room was gone. She was in darkness now, a void so complete it felt like it would swallow her whole. Her phone buzzed one last time. She stared at the screen, her vision blurred by tears. "You shouldn't have done that." Maya blinked, her breath shallow as the black void around her thickened like ink in water. The darkness pressed against her skin, wrapping around her body as if it were alive. She clutched her phone tightly, its faint glow the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Her pulse quickened when she saw it, just ahead, cutting through the darkness like a sliver of forbidden light. A door. It wasn't like the other door she had seen on the street. This one was old, impossibly old. The wood looked splintered and cracked, as if it had been clawed at for centuries. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, each one pulsating faintly, almost like a heartbeat. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and for a moment she hesitated to look. But curiosity and fear overwhelmed her. "Do not open it." She shook her head, her voice trembling as she whispered to herself, "I don't have a choice." The shadows around her began to stir, slithering and writhing as if the void itself had come alive. Whispers echoed in the air, faint and unintelligible, like voices from another world. Maya took a cautious step toward the door. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Her skin prickled, and her legs felt heavy, as though the darkness were trying to pull her back. When she finally reached the door, her hand hovered over the handle. It was ice cold, and the moment her fingers brushed against it, a deep, guttural growl echoed from somewhere behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and the faint remnants of the whispers. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen, her hands trembling. "If you open it, you let them all out." Her stomach twisted. "Let what out?" she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. But she already knew the answer. Maya's grip tightened on the handle. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath. "It's the only way," she whispered, trying to convince herself. The whispers around her became screams as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding white light that poured out like a flood, consuming the darkness. For a brief moment, she felt weightless, like she was floating in an endless void. But then the light faded and she was somewhere else entirely. She stood in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with countless doors, each one slightly different. Some were pristine and polished, while others were rusted and barely holding together. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, the kind that made her ears ring. Her phone buzzed again. "You've made a terrible mistake." Her heart sank as she stared down the hallway. She could feel it now, a presence or perhaps multiple presences. Something was watching her. The first door on her right creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness inside. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "I'm not going in there." But the hallway seemed to have other plans. The floor beneath her feet shifted, tilting slightly, forcing her toward the open door. She dug her heels in, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but it was no use. The shadows from the room spilled out, snaking toward her like living tendrils. They wrapped around her ankles, pulling her forward. She clawed at the floor, her nails scraping against the cold, hard surface, but the shadows were too strong. As she was dragged into the room, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness once again. This time, the darkness wasn't empty. She could hear them, things moving all around her. The sound of claws scraping against the ground, of labored breathing, of whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Her phone buzzed, the light from the screen illuminating the space around her just enough to reveal their shapes. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe more. Pale, humanoid figures with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. Their bodies were twisted and contorted, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. The message on her phone read, "Don't move. They can't see you if you don't move." Her body froze. She held her breath, her muscles trembling as the creatures crept closer. One of them stopped inches from her face, its hollow eyes scanning the air where she stood. She could feel its breath, cold and putrid, brushing against her skin. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to stay still. But her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain they could hear it. The creature let out a low growl, its head tilting sharply to the side. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it moved on, disappearing into the darkness. Maya exhaled slowly, tears streaming down her face. Her phone buzzed again, the light from the screen revealing another message. "You can't stay there. You have to find the next door." Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Maya began to move. Slowly, carefully, she stepped through the darkness, her phone's faint glow guiding her way. The creatures were still there, their pale forms shifting in and out of view. She could hear them breathing, hear their claws scraping against the floor. But as long as she moved slowly, they seemed to ignore her. Her eyes scanned the room, searching desperately for another door. The darkness seemed endless, but then she saw it, a faint outline in the distance, barely visible through the gloom. She made her way toward it, each step feeling like an eternity. The creatures grew more agitated as she moved, their growls and whispers becoming louder. When she finally reached the door, she grasped the handle and turned it as quietly as she could. The door creaked open and she slipped through, slamming it shut behind her. She found herself back in the hallway, but it wasn't the same. The doors were gone, replaced by walls covered in strange, pulsating symbols. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the whispers had returned, louder than ever. Her phone buzzed one last time. The message read, "They're free now. And they're coming for you." The hallway began to shake, the walls cracking and splintering as the symbols glowed brighter. A deafening roar echoed from behind her, and she turned to see the creatures pouring through the door she had just closed. They were faster now, more aggressive. Their hollow eyes glowed with a malevolent light as they charged toward her. Maya ran. Her feet pounded against the floor as she sprinted down the hallway, the creatures gaining on her with every step. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to keep moving. Ahead of her, another door appeared, this one larger and more ornate than the others. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, and a faint golden light seeped through the cracks. She reached for the handle, but before she could open it, the ground beneath her gave way. She fell, her screams swallowed by the darkness as the creatures reached for her, their jagged teeth and clawed hands the last thing she saw before everything went black. I can help continue the story, but generating a full 3,000-word chapter directly here isn't feasible due to space limitations. Instead, I'll break it down into segments, continuing with Chapter 6, and ensure it maintains the intensity and atmosphere you've requested. I'll provide a detailed, engaging portion of the chapter and ask if you'd like me to continue further. Let's get started. Maya awoke with a gasp, her lungs burning as if she had been holding her breath for hours. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, her limbs heavy, as though gravity had grown stronger while she slept. Slowly, she opened her eyes, expecting the oppressive darkness, but instead, she was met with a dull, flickering light. It wasn't bright. It was almost sickly, like the glow of a dying fire. The room around her was stark, cold, and empty, the walls made of a strange, smooth material that didn't feel like anything she'd ever encountered. There were no windows, no doors, just 4 blank walls closing in on her, as though the room itself was a cage. Maya sat up slowly, her pulse racing. The panic that had consumed her moments ago began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep dread that seeped into her skin like the cold that now surrounded her. The air smelled sterile, almost chemical, and it stung her throat as she took shallow breaths. Her phone buzzed. She jerked her hand up to grab it, but her fingers felt stiff, uncoordinated. When she finally managed to unlock it, her eyes scanned the message, her heart skipping a beat. They are not gone. A chill ran down her spine, and her stomach clenched with dread. She had escaped, hadn't she? But the memories of those creatures, their hollow eyes, their inhuman screeches, were vivid in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, waiting for her, lurking in the shadows. Not gone, she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse and trembling. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time had no meaning in this place. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that made your thoughts grow louder and more distorted. But something was different now. The silence was broken. A soft scraping sound echoed in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until Maya could feel it vibrating in her chest. The sound was unmistakable, claws against the floor, dragging as though something with long, sharp fingers was inching toward her. Her breath caught in her throat and she pushed herself back against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows, the creatures, they were still here. A figure emerged from the corner of the room. It was tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, its face featureless except for two wide empty eye sockets that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. It moved in jerks and twitches as though its body was out of sync with reality. Maya's eyes widened and she froze. The figure didn't move toward her, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her with its unnatural energy. It was waiting just as she had been waiting, waiting for her to make the first move. Her phone buzzed again. She couldn't look away from the creature, but she managed to read the message. You can't run from them. They are inside you now. The words sent a shock through her body, as though they had been written for her alone. Inside her. Inside me? Maya's mind raced. She couldn't let that thought take root. She couldn't believe that. She wouldn't. The figure took a step forward, its limbs moving in impossibly slow motion, dragging the shadows along the floor as it came closer. The green glow from its eyes seemed to pulsate with every movement, and Maya's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of the creature's slow, deliberate approach. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. She needed to do something. Anything. Without thinking, she bolted upright and sprinted toward the far wall. The footsteps behind her quickened, growing louder, more urgent, but she didn't dare look back. Her legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, her body screaming with every step, but she pushed forward, faster, harder, until... Bam! She slammed into the wall, the force of the impact jolting her forward. Her vision blurred for a moment as her head spun, but when it cleared, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A door. It was a small, unassuming door, barely noticeable against the cold, metallic wall. There were no handles, no markings, just a seam, a faint line that indicated it could open. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how long that door had been there. Was it always there? Had it appeared when she needed it most, or had it been waiting all along? A low growl echoed from behind her, and she turned just in time to see the creature reach the wall. Its eyes locked onto hers, the green glow intensifying, casting an eerie, sickly light across the room. She didn't hesitate. She rushed for the door, her fingers flying over the seam as she fumbled for a way to open it. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The creature's growl grew louder, and suddenly a hand, a long, twisted hand, reached through the darkness, its fingers grasping at the air. No. She yanked on the door with all her strength, and with a loud screech, it swung open. On the other side of the door, Maya was met with a strange sight, a wide, open field bathed in soft, golden light. It was too perfect, too peaceful to be real. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into soft grass, the scent of fresh earth filling her lungs. But as she looked around, her stomach twisted with unease. The field stretched endlessly in all directions, the horizon broken only by a distant silhouette, a figure standing alone in the center, unmoving. Her phone buzzed again. The message read, "You have crossed into another world. You can't go back." Maya froze. Another world? Was this even real? The figure in the distance turned slowly, its head twisting at an unnatural angle, and Maya's heart skipped a beat as she realized it was looking straight at her. It stepped forward, slowly, with long, deliberate strides, its movements jerky and disconnected, like the creature back in the room. Maya stumbled back, her breath coming in panicked bursts. She didn't know where she was anymore or how she had gotten here. But she did know one thing. Whatever this thing was, whatever was waiting for her here, it wasn't something she could escape. She turned to run, but the field stretched on forever, the silhouette growing closer with each passing second. Her phone buzzed once more. There is no running from what has already found you. Maya's pulse thudded in her ears as she ran, her legs pushing her harder than ever before, the soft grass beneath her feet now a blur. But no matter how fast she moved, the figure in the distance remained just as close, its looming presence never faltering, always there, closing in like a shadow. The field stretched on endlessly, its golden light flickering like a dying star, offering no comfort. Maya could feel it now. The air was different here, thicker, heavier, as though something unnatural was weighing down on her, pulling at her every step. She glanced back, her breath ragged and shallow, her eyes scanning the horizon. The figure had stopped moving. Its head cocked to the side at an unnatural angle, and Maya's stomach dropped. It was staring directly at her, its gaze penetrating, knowing. "It's playing with me." The thought came unbidden, yet it settled deep inside her mind. This wasn't just a chase, it was something worse, something far more terrifying. She wasn't running from it. She was running toward it. Maya forced herself to keep moving, but the panic started to rise again. Her heart was racing, each beat harder than the last. Every step felt as if the field itself was swallowing her up, the grass turning into a swampy mire beneath her feet, the ground sinking with every stride. Then it happened. The world around her shifted. The grass, the sky, the distant horizon, all of it warped, bending in strange, disorienting ways. The air crackled with an electric tension, like the entire world was coming undone. Maya stumbled, her foot catching on something solid, cold, metallic. Her eyes shot down to see the ground beneath her breaking open, a sharp, jagged crack forming where there had once been soft earth. It widened with a rumble, like the earth was splitting open, and a dark abyss stared back at her. Shadows poured from the crack, thick and viscous, like ink spilling out of an open wound. She didn't have time to process it. A cold, sickening hand grabbed her ankle, its fingers ice-cold and unnaturally long, pulling her downward. Maya screamed, desperately trying to shake it off, but the grip tightened with unnatural strength. She kicked out, struggling, but the more she fought, the stronger the hand became. It was pulling her closer to the gaping crack in the earth, and every inch she was dragged felt like an eternity. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't need to read the message. She already knew. It was over. It was too late. Terror flooded her veins, but she refused to let it consume her. She wouldn't let it win. She reached down with both hands, trying to tear the shadowed fingers off her leg, but they were like iron, unbreakable, unyielding. And then she saw it. The figure, the one she had been running from, was standing right above her now, its twisted, skeletal form looming in the light of the strange, golden field. Its eyes glowed, but now they were different. There was no malice in them, no hunger. Only sadness. A deep, endless sorrow that seemed to seep from its very being. A whispering voice echoed around her, soft at first, then louder, and finally, it was all she could hear. "You don't have to fight." Maya stopped struggling for a moment, the words sinking into her consciousness. She blinked, confused, trying to make sense of them. The voice was no longer threatening. It wasn't demanding or angry. It felt almost comforting. "You don't have to run." She looked up, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The figure bent down slowly, its head tilting to meet her gaze. For the first time it seemed human. "I'm not like them," the figure said, its voice a low, melodic whisper. "I was once like you too, and I tried to run. But there is no escape. It's not about fighting." Maya's body went rigid. "Escape? What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure's glowing eyes softened. "This is what happens when you open the door. When you open the door, it is not just the creatures that come. It is not just the shadows. It is the truth. It is the way things are. This place is not a prison. It is the nature of all things. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you will understand. You don't need to fight. You only need to stop running." Maya's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. This didn't make sense. What truth? What do you want from me? The figure straightened up, stepping back, its sad gaze never leaving her. "I want you to stop fighting," it repeated, "because I am not your enemy. I was just like you. But I learned what happens when you stop running. You can live in peace here where there is no time, no fear. Where you never have to be afraid again. All you have to do is accept it." The shadows around her thickened, swirling, reaching for her again. They dragged at her limbs, pulling her deeper into the abyss that was widening beneath her. The coldness of their grip was suffocating. But the figure's words continued to echo in her mind, reverberating through her thoughts, through the chaos. "You don't have to fight. You don't have to run." Maya felt the weight of it all, The pull of the abyss, the swirling darkness, the creature above her, the voice whispering in her mind. She had never felt so small, so powerless. And yet, she understood. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the strange calm of the figure's words began to settle in her chest. There was no running, no escape. There was only this place, this strange, shifting reality. And in the distance, Maya thought she could see something, a glimmer of light, a faint spark in the otherwise endless black. She turned her head toward it, instinctively moving towards the warmth of it. Her heart pounded in her chest. The figure stepped back, its eyes sad yet gentle. And then it spoke one final time. "You're almost there, Maya. But it's your choice." The light in the distance seemed like a beacon, a promise of safety, or at least some form of escape. Maya's pulse quickened as she stumbled toward it, her legs weak and trembling beneath her. She didn't look back at the figure or the shadows pulling at her, though she could feel them at the edges of her consciousness, whispering, beckoning. The field stretched on around her, the golden glow fading with each step. But the light ahead, it remained steady and unwavering. It was strange, unlike anything she had ever seen, and yet it felt familiar, like something she had been searching for her entire life. Maya's breathing was shallow, her throat tight with a mix of fear and desperation. The further she walked, the more the air seemed to shift, as though the world was changing around her. The ground beneath her feet grew harder, colder, and the air itself seemed to become thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. She wanted to stop, to question it all, but the shadows at her back urged her on. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and they seemed to echo from every direction. "You can't escape," one voice hissed. "You belong here. This is your fate." But Maya kept moving. She couldn't let herself stop now, not when there was a chance, however small, that this light held the answers she needed. And then, as if responding to her thoughts, the light flickered, growing brighter with every step she took. The field around her began to twist and warp, the edges of reality blurring, until it felt like the very ground she walked on was unsteady, like it might collapse at any moment. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she pushed herself harder, as if the light itself was pulling her forward, drawing her in. She wasn't sure if she was running towards safety or deeper into the unknown, but she had no choice but to keep going. And then she reached it. The light erupted around her in a burst of warmth, a sensation she hadn't felt in what felt like years. It was like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime of darkness. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her, letting it fill her with a sense of peace she had long forgotten. But when she opened her eyes again, she wasn't in the field anymore. The world around her had changed. Maya found herself standing in the middle of a small, quiet room. The walls were made of stone, rough and weathered, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A single light hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, golden glow across the room. The floor beneath her was covered in faded rugs, worn down with age. She looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There were no windows, no doors, just the soft glow of the light and the stillness that surrounded her. It felt familiar yet wrong, like a place she should have known but didn't. "Where am I?" Maya whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here or what had happened to the field, the shadows, the figure. Had it all been a dream? Was she safe now? Her phone buzzed again. "You're not alone here, Maya." The message made her stomach drop. She wasn't alone? The shadows, the creatures, were they here too? A creak echoed from the far corner of the room, and Maya's head snapped around. The door at the far end, which she hadn't noticed before, slowly began to open, the old hinges groaning under the pressure. A figure stepped through. It wasn't the creature she had been running from, but it was close, too close. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, the outline of its body hidden by the shadows it carried with it. Its face was obscured, but Maya could feel its gaze, even without seeing its eyes. It was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Maya's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't over. It hadn't ended when she stepped into this room. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence filling the room with an unnatural chill. "You've crossed into another place, Maya," it said, its voice smooth and cold. A place where reality is flexible, where things are not what they seem. Maya swallowed hard. "Where am I?" she asked again, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it moved closer, its steps deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. The shadows around it seemed to twist and dance, almost alive, following its every movement. "Where you are doesn't matter," it said finally, its voice low. "What matters is what you do next." Maya stood frozen, her body tense, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do. The figure was right. None of this made sense. She had been running, fighting, desperate for answers. But now, all she felt was the crushing weight of uncertainty. The fear that had been so sharp before was now replaced by something deeper, a sense of inevitability, as if the truth was right in front of her, and she had no choice but to face it. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it could read her thoughts. "You're scared," it said softly. "But you don't have to be." Maya didn't know whether to run, to fight, or to accept whatever fate had brought her here. The shadows in the room seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, and she could feel the temperature drop, the air turning cold and thick. "You're not just here, Maya," the figure said, its voice almost gentle now. "You've always been here. This place is where everything begins." Her heart skipped a beat. Where everything begins. Suddenly, the floor beneath her seemed to shift again. The room twisted, the walls bending in on themselves, and the shadows grew darker, more menacing. A deep, low hum filled the air, and for a brief moment, Maya thought she heard a voice whispering her name. "Maya, Maya." But it was not the figure's voice. It was something else, something ancient, something powerful. She turned, her eyes searching the room for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only shadows, moving, breathing, alive. And then she realized the room itself was alive. The walls, the floor, the very air around her seemed to pulse, as though it was waiting, watching, expecting something from her. And for the first time, Maya understood what the figure had meant. This place wasn't just a location. It was a prison. A prison built on the very nature of reality itself. "You can't escape," the figure whispered, almost as if it were comforting her. "You've always been part of it. And now you're one of us." Maya's heart thundered in her chest as the figure's words echoed in her mind. "You've always been part of it." The phrase lingered in the air, the weight of it pressing down on her like a vice. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. The room around her seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, its walls bending in unnatural ways, the shadows stretching and curling like living things. The air was thick, heavy, and cold. Maya took a tentative step backward, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of reality that no longer seemed to fit. The figure, its face still hidden in shadow, continued to watch her with those unseen eyes, its presence like a dark cloud, suffocating and unyielding. It didn't move, yet it felt as though it was everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke. "What do you mean by, I've always been part of it? What is this place? What's happening?" The figure tilted its head, the shadows twisting around it as if listening, responding to her fear. Its voice, when it spoke, was soft, almost like a whisper, but each word carried an undeniable power. "This place is the center of it all. The beginning, the end, and everything in between. And you, Maya, are woven into its fabric. You always have been." Maya's mind reeled. She staggered back, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, that doesn't make sense. I'm just a normal person. I don't belong here. I don't know anything about this place." The figure took a step forward, its movement smooth and almost graceful, like a shadow gliding across the floor. "Normal," it repeated, almost amused. "What is normal, Maya? Do you think you understand the world you live in? The reality you think you know? This place has always been here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to find it." Maya swallowed hard, feeling the chill of dread settling deep within her bones. "I don't understand. I don't want to understand. Just let me go. Let me leave." A low, sorrowful sound escaped from the figure. "You can't leave, Maya. Not now. Not after everything that has happened. Once the door is opened, there is no going back. It's too late." Maya's breath caught in her throat as a realization hit her. The door. The strange crack in the earth she had seen before, the one she had been running from. It wasn't just some random thing, it was a threshold. A a point of no return. Her mind flashed back to the figure in the field, its sad, glowing eyes. The shadows had been calling her, pulling her toward that crack, toward that door. And now, she stood in this room with no idea how she had crossed into this place or what she was supposed to do next. The figure continued to speak, its voice calm, almost gentle. There are many doors, Maya, and many ways to walk through them. You walked through one, the one you weren't supposed to find. And now you're here. Maya's chest tightened. What do you want from me? The figure took another step forward, the shadows creeping along the floor like tendrils of smoke. I don't want anything from you, but you are the key to everything. You always have been. The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. The key? What does that mean? How am I the key? The figure paused, and for a moment there was silence. Then it spoke again, its voice softer now, almost pitying. You were chosen, Maya. You were always meant to find this place, to open the door, to be part of the cycle. Maya's stomach churned. Cycle? What cycle? The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in shadow. The cycle of beginnings and endings, life and death, reality and illusion. Everything you've known, everything you think you know is just a layer, a veil. And the truth lies beyond it. And you, Maya, are the one who must see it. Maya's legs felt weak, like they might give out from beneath her. She backed up, her breath quickening. I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this. I just want to go home. You are home, the figure said softly. This is where you belong. Where you've always belonged. A chill washed over her, and for the first time since she had arrived in this strange place, Maya felt an overwhelming sense of terror. Not just fear of the unknown, but fear of the truth. Fear of what she was being told. The figure stepped forward again, and as it did, the shadows around it grew larger, filling the room with an almost tangible presence. The air grew colder, the room feeling more confined, like it was closing in on her. Maya's eyes darted around the room, searching for any way out. There were no windows, no doors, just the oppressive darkness that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy curtain. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't understand. I can't be part of this. The figure's voice softened even further. You already are, Maya. You always have been. The room shifted again, the walls warping and bending as though reality itself was stretching and tearing. Maya's knees buckled and she fell to the floor, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed once more, the screen lighting up with another message. She grabbed it frantically, her hands trembling. The door is closing. Time is running out. She looked up in panic, only to see the shadows intensifying, closing in on her from all sides. The figure seemed to melt into the darkness, its form dissolving into the very air around her. No, no, Maya cried out, trying to push herself to her feet. Please don't. The room began to collapse, the walls and floor crumbling away as if the entire structure was disintegrating. The air was thick with the sound of whispers, the voices growing louder and more chaotic. She could feel the weight of it all, the weight of the truth, the weight of the decisions she hadn't made, the weight of the place that was consuming her. The shadows were all around her now, suffocating, choking. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of her name, whispered on the wind. Maya? The darkness enveloped Maya, suffocating her every breath. It was like drowning in an ocean of shadows, each breath stolen away, each second stretching into eternity. She couldn't see, couldn't think. The last thing she remembered was hearing her name whispered from the depths of the abyss, calling her into the void. Maya tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body felt heavy, like she was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Her limbs were frozen, the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The whispers that filled the air grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant hum in her ears. She opened her eyes, but there was no light, no room, no walls, just an endless blackness stretching out before her, as if she was suspended in nothingness. It felt like time had no meaning here, no past, no future, only this endless now. Was she alive? Was this real? The thought clawed at her mind. Her heart pounded in her chest, echoing through the oppressive silence. But as quickly as the panic rose, it was replaced by something far worse: emptiness. An overwhelming, soul-deep emptiness that made her feel as though she were disappearing into the darkness, becoming a part of it. How long had she been here? Was this the end? The place where the cycle of beginnings and endings converged? And then, just when she thought she might lose herself entirely, a flicker of light appeared. A small, fragile spark in the distance. Maya gasped, a desperate hope igniting within her chest. She reached out, her hand trembling as if she could somehow touch it, pull it closer. The light grew brighter and warmer, and with it came a sense of clarity. The whispers faded, replaced by a soft hum of something that felt like peace. The floor beneath her feet was solid again, and she could feel the cool touch of the air against her skin. She looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The world had returned. Not the crumbling room she had been trapped in, but something different, something even more unsettling. The light before her stretched into the shape of a door, glowing faintly in the midst of the dark space. It was beautiful, almost otherworldly, the edges shimmering like the last rays of the setting sun. And standing at the threshold of the door was a figure, a silhouette bathed in the light's radiance. For a moment, Maya froze, unsure if she should approach. She felt both drawn to the figure and terrified of what it might mean. Her heart hammered in her chest as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the light. It was the same figure from before, the one who had been watching her in the stone room. Its face was still obscured by shadows, but Maya felt its presence acutely. Its coldness wrapped around her, suffocating her thoughts. "You've been waiting, Maya," the figure said, its voice like the echo of something long forgotten. Maya's breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand. What is this place? What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it reached out a hand toward her, its fingers glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Maya's own heartbeat. It was like it was offering her something, or taking something from her. "You've crossed through the door," the figure finally said, its voice cold and indifferent. "But the real question is, why did you come?" Maya took a step back, uncertainty and fear flooding her mind. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of this." The figure tilted its head, a slow motion that seemed deliberate, almost calculating. "No? You think it was a choice? No, Maya. This has always been your path. You are here because you were meant to be. Because you were always meant to find it." Maya shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She had been running, fighting, desperate to escape. She had been trying to find a way out of this nightmare. But now, as the figure's words sunk in, the truth began to settle over her like a cold shroud. "I don't believe you," she whispered. "This isn't my fate. I don't belong here. I don't belong in this, whatever this is." The figure's laugh was low and hollow, like the wind blowing through an empty hall. It was both distant and close at the same time. "Oh, Maya, you do belong. You've always belonged. You are part of this cycle. The cycle of souls who wander through time, looking for meaning, looking for answers. You are the key to understanding it all. You always have been." Maya's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She tried to move away, but her legs wouldn't respond. The figure's presence had a weight to it, a suffocating gravity that held her in place. She could feel her mind spiraling, her thoughts racing in every direction, but nothing made sense. "You say I'm the key," she said, her voice breaking. "What does that even mean? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to understand?" The figure didn't answer immediately. It simply stood there, still and silent, as the air around Maya grew colder, thicker, almost like she was suffocating. And then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just the figure. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the very fabric of reality itself. It was a voice Maya didn't recognize, but she knew it deep down. It was the voice that had whispered her name, the voice that had haunted her every step. "The cycle must continue, Maya." The words echoed around her, reverberating through her mind. The figure stepped back, slowly fading into the light, its form dissolving like smoke, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence behind. The door in front of her remained, glowing brighter now, almost blinding. Maya felt the pull of it, the weight of its gravity drawing her closer, urging her forward. But what was on the other side? What lay beyond this threshold? A sudden image flashed in her mind, a memory, or was it a premonition? She saw herself standing before the door, walking through it. But when she crossed, she wasn't the same. She felt different, changed. The world on the other side was not the same. It was dark and desolate, a place where time had no meaning, where souls were trapped, endlessly repeating the cycle, waiting for the door to open once more. Maya gasped, her body trembling as she realized the truth. The door was not a way out. It was the beginning of something much worse. The beginning of the endless cycle. She had crossed into the cycle once, and now she stood at its very heart. Was this her destiny? Was there any way out? With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her feet moving almost of their own accord, carrying her toward the glowing threshold. The light seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her into its depths. And as she crossed the door, Maya understood there was no escape. She had entered a place beyond time, beyond reality. A place where the cycle was eternal and there was no end. She was part of it now. And the cycle had begun again. Maya's feet landed heavily on the cold, cracked floor as she passed through the glowing threshold. Her body felt heavier, as though the very air around her was more oppressive, more suffocating. The room she entered was unlike any place she had seen before. It wasn't a room really, it was more like a vast, endless expanse stretching far beyond the limits of her vision. The light that had guided her, the light of the door, was now gone, leaving her in an inky darkness that swallowed everything in its path. Yet, in this darkness there were faint glimmers of something that shimmered like stars but felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful like stars should be. It was jagged, sharp like shattered glass. Maya's breath quickened as she took tentative steps forward, the sounds of her footsteps echoing through the infinite void. The shadows seemed to shift around her, pulsating and breathing, their edges curling and twisting like tendrils. But no matter how she looked, there was nothing but endless darkness surrounding her. She couldn't see the ceiling, the walls, or the floor, just the darkness and the broken shards of light. It felt as though the ground itself was unstable, as if it was alive, shifting beneath her feet. Her legs trembled as she walked further into the space, the hairs on the back of her neck rising with every step she took. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to leave this place, but she couldn't. She was already too far in, and something deep within her, a terrible, undeniable force, pushed her forward. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to keep moving. The whispers returned, soft at first, like a distant murmur in the wind. But soon they grew louder, clearer, as if the darkness itself was speaking to her. She could hear fragments of voices, words she couldn't quite make out, but they felt familiar. They were her words, her thoughts, but twisted, warped into something darker, more sinister. Maya? The voice came from all directions, and for a moment she couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was as though the very air was calling her name, beckoning her deeper into the void. Maya? Her heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Just the darkness. "What do you want from me?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Why am I here?" The silence that followed was suffocating. But then, from the depths of the darkness, something emerged. At first, it was only a silhouette, an indistinct shape in the periphery of her vision. But it grew, becoming clearer with every passing second. A figure, her figure, stood in the darkness. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer. It looked just like her, yet somehow different. Its features were blurred, shifting, like a reflection in water disturbed by ripples. It was her face, but distorted, as though twisted by some unseen force. "Maya," the figure whispered again, and its voice was familiar, too familiar. Maya's pulse quickened, a surge of panic rising within her chest. "What is this?" she whispered. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised its hand, the movement slow and deliberate, as if the action were a ritual. The darkness around them seemed to respond, the space vibrating as though the very fabric of reality was warping. The figure's face became clearer now, but the more it solidified, the more wrong it felt. It was her, but not her. "Why are you here, Maya?" the figure asked, its voice now sounding as though it echoed from 1,000 different versions of herself. "What do you want?" Maya's throat tightened and she took a step back. "I don't want anything. I just want to leave." The figure shook its head slowly, its movements disjointed, almost unnatural. Leaving isn't an option anymore. The world around Maya shifted again, the darkness turning into something else, something far worse. The air grew colder, the sharpness of the broken light intensifying, slicing through the void like 1,000 knives. She was no longer in control of her own thoughts, her own body. The whispers, now louder, filled her mind, each voice screaming at her, each one offering something she couldn't quite understand. They felt like memories, her memories, but distorted, fractured. The figure raised its hand again, and suddenly the void split open. A mirror appeared before Maya, suspended in the air, its surface smooth and shining like liquid glass. But it wasn't just any mirror. It was a mirror that reflected more than just her face. Maya stared into it, her heart sinking as she saw herself reflected. But this reflection wasn't a simple image. It was a series of images, fragments of her life, of her past, each one shifting like a shattered pane of glass. It was as though the mirror was showing her every moment of her existence, every decision, every step that had led her to this place. The reflection fractured further, showing different versions of herself, each one taking a different path, making different choices. Some of these versions were smiling, happy, living normal lives. Others were broken, twisted, filled with despair. And at the center of it all was Maya, the real Maya, standing frozen in place as though waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The distorted reflection began to speak, its voice echoing in the silence. "You think you've been running, don't you, Maya? But running is all you've ever done." Maya's heart pounded as the voice continued. It was the voice of her fears, her regrets, the doubts that had always lingered in the back of her mind. "The cycle doesn't just exist around you," the reflection said. "It is you. You are the cycle." Maya's knees buckled as the weight of those words hit her like a freight train. The cycle, the one the figure had spoken of, the endless repetition. It wasn't something external. It wasn't something she could escape. She was the cycle. "No," Maya whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be true. This can't be real." The figure in the darkness smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent chills down her spine. "It's always been real, Maya. You are bound to it. Bound to this place, to this moment." The reflection in the mirror shifted again, this time showing Maya standing in front of the door, the very same door she had passed through. But when she reached for the handle, her hand passed right through it as if the door wasn't really there at all. The door was an illusion, and so was the world she had thought she understood. "You've been here before," the figure whispered, its voice like ice. "You'll be here again." Maya stumbled back, her breath shallow and erratic. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this." The figure's eyes narrowed. "It doesn't matter what you want. You can't escape the truth. You can't escape the cycle." The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, and the shards flew outward, embedding themselves into the darkness. Maya stood there, trembling, surrounded by the fragments of her own reflection, each piece a different version of herself. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the void. And then, from the depths of the shadows, a hand reached out, its fingers cold and unyielding. It was the figure again, the one who had been watching her from the start, the one who had spoken of the cycle. But now it was more than just a figure. It was a presence, a force that Maya couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. Maya felt a pull, a terrifying, irresistible pull, drawing her toward the hand. And though she fought against it with every ounce of strength she had left, she knew deep down that she couldn't escape it. The cycle had already begun. Maya's mind was racing as she stood there, staring into the abyss. The pull of the figure's hand was undeniable. It wasn't a simple tug, it was like gravity itself had changed, pulling her toward an inescapable fate. Her body, despite her attempts to fight it, began moving forward. Each step felt as though the ground beneath her was growing softer, like she was walking on air. But the sense of dread grew stronger with every moment. She tried to scream, to call out, but no sound escaped her lips. The weight of the silence around her was suffocating, as if the very universe had muted everything, leaving her to face her fate in a world that didn't even seem real anymore. There was no longer any way to tell where the end of the room was or if the room even had an end at all. The walls, the air, the space, it was all distorted, bent out of shape. The figure's hand reached toward her, its fingers stretched out like claws. Each movement it made was slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring her terror. The space around her seemed to ripple with the figure's presence, like the fabric of reality itself was being warped, twisted, and stretched by its power. "Come closer, Maya," the figure whispered in her mind, its voice now a low, hypnotic hum. "You know you can't run from this." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickening as her feet carried her forward against her will. She had tried to fight back, tried to escape, but with each step she only felt more trapped. It was as if the very act of resisting was feeding the darkness, making it stronger, more inevitable. She couldn't keep up with her thoughts. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn around, to escape, but there was no way out. She was losing control. The fear that had gripped her heart when she first entered this place was now a constant, gnawing presence. The shadow of the figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. She had never felt so small, so powerless. "You think you're in control, don't you?" the figure taunted, its voice not just in her ears, but in her head, in her soul. "But you never were, Maya. You've always been a puppet, and I've always been the strings pulling you along." Her legs shook with terror, but there was no stopping. She was moving toward the figure. No, she was being moved toward the figure. Her feet weren't even touching the ground anymore. She was floating, drifting closer, unable to break free from the invisible force that was guiding her. "Stop. Please," she cried out, but the words came out strangled, barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this anymore." The figure didn't answer, but it didn't have to. The coldness of its presence filled her senses, suffocating her, drowning out everything else. The darkness grew thicker, and she felt herself slipping further away from everything she had known. She had to break free. She had to fight back. But how? A thought began to form in the back of her mind, a small, fragile thought, like a light in the distance. Maybe there was a way to escape, to break the cycle. She wasn't sure how or why, but it was the only thing she could hold on to. The only way to make sense of this madness. As she drifted closer to the figure, she reached inside herself, searching for any remnants of control, any shred of defiance that still lingered in her spirit. The figure was so close now, its presence so overpowering, that she could feel its coldness radiating off of it, wrapping itself around her like chains. But something inside her began to stir, a pulse, a spark of resistance that flickered in the depths of her soul. "I won't let this be the end." The darkness responded to her thoughts. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the space around her was growing tighter with every second. The figure's fingers reached for her, and she could feel the sharpness of its touch as it grazed her skin. But Maya clenched her fists, her body trembling with fear and determination. The spark inside her grew, fed by her defiance. She refused to give in. She couldn't. Not now. The figure's eyes, the only part of it that was fully visible, glowed with a malicious light, watching her closely as though savoring her struggle. It was enjoying her terror, feeding off of it. But Maya could feel something shifting within her. The fear that had once paralyzed her was beginning to turn into something else, something stronger, more focused. "Do you think you can fight me?" the figure asked, its voice mocking. "You've been running from me all along. You are nothing without me." But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the figure anymore. She had her eyes fixed on something else, on the faint glimmer of light that had appeared in the distance. It was small, so small that at first she wasn't sure if it was real. But it was there, beckoning her forward, offering her a way out of the suffocating darkness. Without thinking, Maya willed herself toward it. She felt the grip of the figure's power tighten around her, but she pushed through it, focusing all of her energy on the light. She wasn't sure if she could escape, if the light was real, or if it was just another illusion, but it didn't matter. She had to try. She had to. With every ounce of strength, she reached for the light, her heart racing, her thoughts a blur of panic and determination. The figure screamed in fury as Maya broke free from its grip, pulling herself toward the light with everything she had. The darkness around her thrashed, fighting to keep her in its grasp, but Maya didn't stop. She couldn't stop. And then, just as the figure's clawing hand reached for her once more, she leaped into the light. The moment her body touched it, everything went white. When Maya opened her eyes, the world was different. She wasn't sure how long she had been out, but the overwhelming white light she had jumped into had faded into a soft, hazy glow. Slowly, her senses began to return. The stifling weight of the darkness had lifted, but in its place there was something else. A sharp, unsettling silence that filled the air, a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She blinked several times, trying to make sense of what was around her. The landscape was stark, barren, and unsettling. There were no walls, no ceilings, no familiar structures at all. Just an endless expanse of cracked, gray earth stretching out before her. The ground beneath her feet was cold, as if it had never known warmth. In the distance, jagged black mountains rose up like broken teeth against the dim, clouded sky. For a moment, Maya just stood there, uncertain of what to do. The light from earlier was nowhere to be seen, and she was alone in the vast, empty landscape. But despite the overwhelming emptiness, there was an eerie sense of familiarity here, like she had been here before, or like this place had always been part of her. Maya took a few steps forward, her heart thudding in her chest. The silence pressed in on her, and each step felt heavier than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something, or someone, was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. Suddenly she froze. She heard something. A faint sound like footsteps, but they weren't hers. They were too slow, too deliberate. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing behind her, only the endless stretch of desolate land. Her pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, closer. It was real. It was coming from somewhere, and Maya had no idea what it was. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground, rooted in place by some invisible force. Then, from the shadows of the distant mountains, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a silhouette, a figure moving slowly toward her. But as it drew closer, Maya could see it more clearly. It was a person. Or at least it looked like one. The figure was tall, its features hidden by a dark cloak that fluttered in the wind, though there was no wind to stir it. The cloak seemed to shimmer and distort, as if it wasn't quite real, as if the fabric itself was alive, breathing, shifting with every movement. The figure's hands were hidden, but its posture was rigid, commanding. Maya took a step back, instinctively retreating, but the figure seemed to sense her fear. It stopped in its tracks, and for a moment they just stared at each other. The silence between them was deafening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Who are you?" Maya found herself asking, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it took another step toward her, moving with an unnatural grace, its footsteps soft but purposeful. There was something deeply unsettling about its movement. Each step seemed deliberate, calculated, as if it were playing a game with her. When the figure finally spoke, its voice was low and guttural, like the sound of gravel being crushed beneath heavy boots. "You're not supposed to be here." Maya's blood ran cold at the words. She wanted to protest, to argue, but she couldn't find the strength to speak. Something about the figure's presence was suffocating, as though it held the power to erase her very existence with a single word. "I don't understand," she managed, her throat dry. "Where am I? What is this place?" The figure's eyes, the only part of it that was visible beneath the cloak, glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "This place is not for the living. It is a reflection, a memory, a truth hidden beneath the skin of what you thought you knew." Maya's mind raced. A memory? A truth? What did that even mean? She had so many questions, so many things she needed to understand. But the more the figure spoke, the more she felt herself being drawn into its words, like a moth to a flame. "You have crossed the line, Maya," the figure continued, its voice now tinged with a strange, almost cruel amusement. "You have broken the cycle. But breaking it doesn't mean you're free. It only means you are bound to a new one, a more permanent one." Maya's heart sank as the weight of the figure's words began to sink in. Was she trapped here in this strange place forever? Was she bound to a cycle she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried? The fear that had started as a spark in her chest now bloomed into something much darker, more powerful. I'm not trapped," she said, though her voice faltered. "I escaped. I broke free." The figure cocked its head as if considering her words. Then it stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Maya could feel the coldness of its aura, the oppressive weight of its power. Did you truly break free, Maya?" the figure asked softly, the words laced with venom. "Or are you just another player in a game that has no end? You thought you could escape the cycle. But the cycle is you. You are its core, its heart." Maya staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's words felt like daggers, sharp and unyielding. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, I'm not. I can't be." The figure's laugh was low and hollow, reverberating through the empty space. "You are. You always have been." With those words, the figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath Maya's feet seemed to tremble. The air around her became thick, almost suffocating, and Maya felt her body grow heavy, as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. "You will never escape, Maya," the figure said, its voice growing darker, more menacing. "Not from the cycle. Not from yourself." The ground trembled again, and Maya's vision began to blur. The edges of her reality were warping, distorting as if everything around her was dissolving into the void. She was falling again. Falling into the darkness, falling into the void that she had escaped from only moments before. And this time she knew it wouldn't be so easy to break free. Maya's breath was ragged, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, each beat a reminder of how close she was to losing everything. The dark figure had vanished into the shadows, but its words haunted her, echoed in the stillness around her. The cycle is you. You are its core, its heart. Her body felt heavy, like she was sinking into the earth, swallowed whole by the coldness that had gripped her once again. The light that had once been her salvation had disappeared, leaving her in complete darkness. The air around her was thick, oppressive, pressing in from all sides, and it was all she could do not to suffocate. She stumbled forward, trying to find her bearings, but the ground beneath her feet was uneven, shifting. It felt like she was walking on a path that had no end. The sensation of being trapped had returned. No matter how far she walked, it was as if she had never moved at all. The same gray, lifeless landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. Where am I? Maya's head spun, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Her mind was struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The figure, its cryptic words, the overwhelming sense of dread, it was all too much. How had she ended up here? And why did it feel like she had been here before? Was she truly trapped? Was there no way out? Each step felt like an eternity. The silence around her was so complete that it seemed to absorb everything, even her thoughts. The weight of the darkness was closing in, and she could feel her sanity slipping away. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the sound was swallowed by the silence, as if even her voice wasn't welcome here. Her legs were shaking, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had no idea how long she had been walking, or if she was even going anywhere at all. Time had lost all meaning in this place. All that mattered now was the feeling that she was on the edge of something. Something huge, something terrifying. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Maya gasped, her heart leaping into her throat as she felt herself falling. The sensation of weightlessness lasted for only a moment, but it was enough to send a wave of panic crashing over her. Her stomach lurched as the air rushed past her, her body twisting as she plummeted deeper into the abyss. Then, with a violent jolt, her body slammed against something hard and everything went black. When Maya opened her eyes again, she was lying on cold, unforgiving stone. She could barely move, her limbs stiff and aching from the fall. Her head throbbed, a dull, constant pulse that made her dizzy and nauseous. But through the haze of pain, something else began to creep into her consciousness. A feeling of intense heaviness, like the very air around her was weighed down with 1,000 burdens. She forced herself to sit up, her arms trembling as they pushed her body into an upright position. The first thing she noticed was the vast expanse before her. A cavern. A huge, yawning pit of darkness that stretched far beyond the reach of her eyes. The walls of the cavern rose up on either side, jagged and sharp, covered in patches of damp moss and ancient markings she couldn't quite make out. And then she heard it. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of something ancient, something alive, buried deep beneath the earth. It vibrated through her bones, sending shivers through her spine. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly rose to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in this place. Something was watching her, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. She didn't know what it was, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and every instinct in her screamed for her to run, to get out, to escape. But she couldn't. There was nowhere to run. The walls of the cavern were sheer, impossible to climb. The floor beneath her was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and strange, glowing fungi that pulsed with an eerie, sickly light. In the distance she could make out shapes, shadows, moving figures. Too far away to be sure, but they were there, lurking, waiting. And that hum, it was growing louder. With her heart racing, Maya took a step forward, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Her eyes darted from one shadow to the next, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to what might be hiding in the darkness. But the cavern offered no answers. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, watching her every move. Her mind spun, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of everything. The figure in the cloak, the words it had spoken, the feeling of being bound to this place, trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Was this it? Was this where it all ended? Then a sound broke the silence. A whisper. A soft, haunting whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. You can't escape. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The shadows around her twisted and shifted, playing tricks on her eyes. The hum had grown louder, almost deafening, vibrating through the stone beneath her feet. The whisper came again. You can't escape. Not from the cycle. Not from yourself. Her breath hitched in her throat. The words hit her like a blow to the chest, and for a moment she was paralyzed. The weight of the figure's words, the truth it had spoken, seemed to press down on her, suffocating her. Not from yourself. The words echoed in her mind over and over again, until they drowned out everything else. She could feel the presence of something. Someone, in the shadows, watching her, waiting. But what was it? What did it want from her? Why was she here? And then, as if the cavern itself had come alive, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Maya's eyes widened in panic as the hum reached a deafening crescendo, the sound so loud now that it seemed to vibrate the very air around her. The walls of the cavern shook, and the shadows on the floor seemed to grow longer, darker, reaching toward her like fingers, eager to pull her into the depths. Who's there? Maya shouted, her voice trembling with fear. What do you want from me? The shadows shifted, and in the center of the cavern, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was tall, humanoid, but its form was distorted, like a twisted reflection of a human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The figure's mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong in this world, a grin that seemed to stretch too wide, too impossibly far. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, its form flickering and shifting with every movement. Its voice was low and resonant, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. You have been chosen, Maya, it said, its voice a whisper that echoed through the cavern. Chosen to break the cycle. Chosen to become the cycle. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her mind racing. She didn't understand. None of this made sense. She had come here to escape, to break free from the darkness. But now, it seemed like the darkness was consuming her whole. I don't want this, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't want to be part of the cycle anymore. I want to leave. The figure's grin widened, stretching impossibly far. You cannot leave, Maya. You are already here. And you will never escape. The ground trembled again, and the shadows surged forward, encircling her, tightening their grip. Maya screamed as the darkness closed in, and she felt herself being dragged into the abyss. Maya's screams echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the jagged stone walls, but no one was there to hear them. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her deeper into its grip. The shadows, thick and oppressive, coiled around her like chains, each one tightening, dragging her toward the depths of the cavern where she felt she might never escape. Her heart was racing, pounding in her ears like a war drum, as she fought to break free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. But the more she struggled, the more she sank. Every motion seemed futile, as if the very air was trying to stop her from escaping, from resisting. You can't fight it, Maya, the figure's voice came again, distant yet so close as though it was a part of the cavern itself. You belong here. You always have. The words were like a punch to her stomach. The realization crashed over her like a wave. This was the cycle. It was not some external force, some evil entity that had trapped her here. No, it was her. It had always been her. Maya gasped, her breath shallow and ragged. Was this her fate? To be consumed by the darkness, to become part of this endless cycle that she could never escape? But as the shadows tightened around her, something shifted. A flicker of defiance sparked deep within her. She was not going to give up. She could feel it. This was not the end, not yet. Her eyes shot open, and she let out a guttural cry, focusing every ounce of strength into one final desperate attempt to free herself. The darkness responded by tightening its grip, pushing back harder. But Maya didn't relent. She pushed harder, the light of her will flickering in the darkest of places. The figure in the shadows watched, its twisted grin unwavering, as if it found some amusement in her struggle. You think you can escape your fate? You are the one who brought this upon yourself? Maya's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, a way to break the cycle. She remembered something, the vision she had seen earlier, the whispers from the depths of the caverns, the promise of something greater, something beyond the terror. The choice was hers. A memory flashed in her mind, a memory from before all of this, when her life had been simpler, when she had still believed she had control over her destiny. That was the moment everything had shifted. That was when she had made a choice, the choice to stop running. Maya's eyes narrowed, and in that instant, the realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The cycle was not some external force she could escape by running or hiding. It was within her, a part of her. To break it, she would need to face it head-on, to confront the darkness within herself. "You're right," Maya said, her voice shaky but firm. "I have always been a part of this cycle. But that doesn't mean I have to be defined by it." The shadows seemed to hesitate, the figure watching her with a curious intensity. It was as if it hadn't expected this answer, hadn't expected Maya to stand her ground. "You're wrong," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not a prisoner here. I don't belong to you or this place." The darkness recoiled, pulling back for a moment as though uncertain, unsure of how to respond. It was then that Maya saw it, the faintest shimmer of light in the distance just beyond the shadows. It was small at first, like the tiniest star in the vast expanse of night. But it grew brighter, and she could feel the warmth radiating from it. It was a beacon, a sign that there was still hope. Her heart surged as she took a tentative step toward the light, her feet finally finding solid ground. The shadows seemed to shrink away from her, reluctant to let go but unable to hold her back. The closer she got to the light, the more the oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to lift. And then, with a single, final step, she was through. The darkness that had consumed her for so long shattered like glass, disintegrating into nothingness. The light enveloped her, warm and bright, until she felt as if she had been reborn. She gasped, sucking in air as if she had been underwater for far too long. The cool, fresh air of freedom filled her lungs. The weight that had pressed down on her was gone, and the silence that had once felt suffocating now seemed peaceful, calm. For a moment, Maya stood there, stunned, her heart still racing but no longer from fear. She was free. She had done it. The cycle had been broken. But just as she began to breathe a sigh of relief, she heard it, the faintest whisper like a breath against her ear. "You cannot break the cycle. It is always there." Maya froze, her body tensing, every muscle going rigid. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like it was embedded in the very fabric of reality itself. "You are not done, Maya," it whispered. "You never will be." Maya's heart pounded once more, but this time she didn't feel fear. She felt something else, an understanding, a clarity. The cycle was not something she could outrun. It was part of her, a reflection of the choices she made, the darkness and light within her. But it didn't control her anymore. She was in control now. "Then I'll face it," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'll face it until the end." The light around her pulsed once, as if in agreement, and she stepped forward, no longer afraid. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she was ready for whatever came next. Because this time she would not run. She would stand tall, and she would break the cycle once and for all. Story 2. Chapter 1. The rain started as a drizzle, tapping against the windshield like nervous fingers. Nathan adjusted the wipers, their rhythmic squeak breaking the oppressive silence inside the car. Beside him, the passenger seat was empty, save for a crumpled map that he hadn't needed in years. This route, this cursed unlit stretch of road, was familiar. Too familiar. Yet tonight it felt alien. He was late. Again. His sister had insisted on him visiting for dinner, guilt tripping him with a reminder about how little family they had left. "Come by," she'd said. "I'll keep the stew warm." Now her house seemed a lifetime away, swallowed by the storm and the endless expanse of blacktop. The dashboard clock blinked. 9:47 p.m. A shrill noise cut through the quiet. Nathan flinched, fumbling for his phone. The screen lit up with an unknown number. His thumb hovered over the answer button before he thought better of it and let the call ring out. Moments later, a voicemail notification popped up. He hesitated, but curiosity tugged at him. The voice on the recording was static-ridden, broken by bursts of noise that sounded like screaming. His blood ran cold. It wasn't words. It wasn't a prank. It was something else. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The headlights carved through the rain, illuminating the narrow road ahead. Trees lined both sides like shadowy sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The air inside the car grew thick, oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Then he saw it. A figure staggered into the beam of his headlights. It came from nowhere, arms flailing, soaked to the bone. Nathan slammed the brakes, tires screeching against wet asphalt. The car skidded, narrowly avoiding the person who now stood frozen, illuminated in stark white light. Nathan's heart pounded as he rolled down the window. Rain lashed at his face. "Are you okay?" he shouted. The figure didn't respond. It was a man mid-30s maybe, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans smeared with mud. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes, they didn't look right. Too wide. Too empty. Nathan got out, his boots splashing in the puddles. "Hey, do you need help?" The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, he reached out, his hand trembling. Nathan instinctively stepped back. "Look, I can call someone," Nathan said, his voice wavering. "An ambulance or—" The man's hand shot forward, gripping Nathan's wrist with surprising strength. Nathan tried to pull away, but the man leaned in close, his breath ragged. "Don't stop," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Keep driving?" Nathan's stomach knotted. "What?" The man's grip loosened and he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Nathan's mind raced. He glanced back at his car, its warm interior suddenly feeling miles away. Against his better judgment, he crouched next to the man, shaking him gently. "Hey, wake up." The man's eyes snapped open. He bolted upright, grabbing Nathan's shoulders. "They're coming," he hissed. "Don't stop, no matter what you hear." Before Nathan could respond, the man pushed him away and sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Nathan stood there, drenched and shivering, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell?" he muttered, climbing back into the car. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel. He wanted to call someone, the police, his sister, anyone, but the man's words echoed in his mind. Don't stop. No matter what you hear, The rain intensified, the storm howling like a living thing. Nathan pressed the gas pedal, eager to leave this stretch of road behind. But as he drove, a gnawing unease settled over him. The trees seemed closer now, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the moonlight. The road felt narrower, the rain heavier. His headlights flickered. Just for a second. A sound rose above the storm. At first he thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. A shriek. High-pitched, inhuman. Nathan's throat tightened. He checked the rearview mirror. Nothing but rain and darkness. Then the car jolted. Something had hit the back bumper. Art. Nathan's heart leaped as he fought to steady the wheel. He glanced in the mirror again, but there was still nothing. No animal, no car. Just shadows. He pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just a shriek. It was a cacophony of noises, screaming, growling, wet, guttural sounds that made his skin crawl. He couldn't tell if it was coming from outside the car or inside his head. The road twisted sharply, and Nathan's tires skidded on the slick pavement. He gritted his teeth, barely managing to stay on the road. His headlights flickered again, then cut out entirely. Panic clawed at his chest as he slammed the brakes. The car lurched to a stop, plunging him into darkness. For a moment, all he could hear was the rain and his own ragged breathing. He fumbled for his phone, the glow of its screen a small comfort in the pitch-black cabin. As he reached for the flashlight app, a soft tapping sound came from the driver's side window. Tap, tap, tap. Nathan froze. The sound wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was deliberate, measured. He turned his head slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. In the faint reflection of his phone screen, he saw it. A face, pressed against the glass, pale and distorted, its features obscured by the rain. Its eyes were wide and empty, just like the man's. Nathan's scream caught in his throat as he fumbled with the keys, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. He tried again, the engine roaring to life just as the face vanished. He slammed the accelerator, the car lurching forward as he tore down the road. The noises didn't stop. They followed him, growing louder, more chaotic. Shapes moved in the trees, fleeting glimpses of figures that seemed to melt into the shadows. Nathan's grip on the wheel was so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare slow down. He didn't dare look back. The road began to change. The pavement cracked and buckled as if the earth itself was rejecting it. Potholes appeared, forcing Nathan to swerve violently. His headlights illuminated a sign up ahead, its words barely legible through the rain, "Bridge out." Nathan's breath hitched. He couldn't stop. Not now. The shrieking was deafening, the figures in the trees closer than ever. He pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the car hurtling toward the broken bridge. Just as he reached the edge, he caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A mass of shapes, humanoid but twisted, spilling onto the road behind him. Their mouths were open, filled with teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. Their eyes, empty, hollow voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. Nathan screamed as the car launched off the broken bridge. For a moment he was weightless. Then the world tilted and everything went black. When he came to, the rain had stopped. The car was overturned, steam rising from the crumpled hood. Nathan groaned, pain radiating through his body. He unbuckled his seatbelt, crawling out through the shattered window. His surroundings were unrecognizable. The bridge was gone, the road swallowed by dense forest. The only sound was his own labored breathing. But he wasn't alone. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, he saw them. The shapes. Watching. Waiting. Nathan staggered to his feet, adrenaline dulling the pain. He didn't know where he was or how to get out, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stop. Chapter 2. Nathan's legs felt heavy as he trudged through the damp forest, his breath ragged and shallow. The car was a wreck, overturned and useless, and the shapes he'd glimpsed near the tree line hadn't moved, yet. His survival instincts kicked in, every nerve in his body screaming for him to move. He had no idea where he was or where the road might lead, but staying put wasn't an option. The forest seemed alive, the thick canopy overhead blocking out any semblance of moonlight. Shadows danced between the trees, their movements too fluid, too deliberate. He kept his steps quiet, though every snapped twig underfoot sent his heart racing. A faint noise echoed behind him. A crackling sound like leaves crushed underfoot. Nathan froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. He strained to hear more, but the forest had gone eerily silent again. He forced himself to take another step, then another. The crunching sound came again, louder this time. Closer. Panic surged through him, but he didn't look back. Keep moving, he told himself, his mind replaying the stranger's warning over and over. Don't stop. No matter what you hear. But then he heard it. A whisper. His name, spoken so softly it could have been mistaken for the wind. Nathan. He froze. The whisper came again, closer, more insistent. Nathan. Who's there? He called, his voice shaky. He regretted it instantly. The whisper turned into a low, guttural growl. He didn't wait to see what made the sound. Nathan broke into a run, weaving through the trees as fast as his legs would carry him. Branches clawed at his arms and face, the forest seemingly working against him. He stumbled into a clearing, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The growling had stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse. He turned in a circle, searching for any sign of escape. That's when he saw it, a faint light in the distance. It flickered like a flame, warm and inviting, and utterly out of place in this forsaken wilderness. Nathan hesitated. Every horror movie he'd ever seen screamed at him to stay away from the mysterious light, but his options were limited. The alternative was staying in the dark, with whatever was out there calling his name. He stepped toward the light, cautiously at first, then faster as the glow grew brighter. It led him to a cabin, small and weathered, its windows glowing with the inviting warmth of candlelight. Relief flooded him. Shelter. Nathan approached the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood before he even realized what he was doing. Hello? Is anyone there? The door creaked open, revealing a woman. She was middle-aged, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and a weary look in her eyes. She held a lantern in one hand, its light casting long shadows across the cabin's interior. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice low and grave. Nathan's relief evaporated. I don't have anywhere else to go, he said. My car crashed and there's something out there. The woman's expression darkened. She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. Quickly, before they see you. Nathan didn't need to be told twice. He stepped inside and she bolted the door behind him. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and shelves lined with jars of preserved food. Despite the warmth, an air of unease hung heavy in the room. "Who are you?" Nathan asked. "My name doesn't matter," she said, setting the lantern on a table. "What matters is that you listen to me if you want to survive the night." Nathan frowned. "Survive the night? What are you talking about?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world rested on them. "They've been hunting this forest for decades," she said. "Once they've marked you, they won't stop until they've taken what they want." Nathan's stomach churned. "Who's they?" The woman's gaze flicked to the window, her expression grim. "You've seen them, haven't you? The shapes in the dark?" Nathan nodded, his throat dry. "What are they?" She shook her head. "No one knows for sure. Some say they're spirits trapped between worlds. Others think there's something older, something worse. What I do know is that they're relentless. And if you don't follow the rules, you're as good as dead." "Rules?" Nathan echoed. The woman reached into a drawer and pulled out a piece of paper, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. She handed it to him. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 5 rules. Do not stop moving unless you're in a shelter. Never look directly at them. Do not respond if they call your name. If you hear the sound of a bell, run. Never, under any circumstances, leave the marked path. Nathan's hands trembled as he read the list. "This can't be real," he muttered. The woman's expression hardened. "You've already seen what they can do. Do you really want to test them?" Before Nathan could respond, a faint ringing sound echoed through the cabin. His blood ran cold. It was a bell, its tone soft and melodic, but somehow menacing. The woman's eyes widened. "They've found us," she whispered. She grabbed a rifle from the corner of the room and shoved it into Nathan's hands. "You need to go. Now." "What?" "I can't. If you stay here, we're both dead," she snapped, her voice trembling with urgency. She pushed him toward the back door. "Follow the path. It's marked with white stones. Whatever you do, don't stray from it." Nathan hesitated, his mind racing. The bell rang again, louder this time. Shadows flickered outside the windows, growing darker and more distinct. "Go!" the woman shouted, shoving him out the door. The forest swallowed him whole. Rain began to fall again, soaking him to the bone as he stumbled onto the path. White stones glistened in the dim light, their placement uneven but clear enough to follow. He clutched the rifle tightly, though he had no idea how to use it. Behind him, the cabin's windows shattered. A guttural scream tore through the night, followed by the sickening sound of flesh ripping. Nathan didn't look back. He ran, his legs burning as he pushed forward. The path twisted and turned, the white stones sometimes disappearing for agonizing stretches before reappearing. The bell rang again, impossibly close now. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he rounded a corner and saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. It was the woman from the cabin. But something was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. "Nathan," she said, her voice flat and unnatural. "Come back." He froze. The rules flashed in his mind. Do not respond if they call your name. The figure stepped closer, her movements jerky and inhuman. "Nathan," she repeated, her tone sweet and coaxing. "It's safe now. Come back." Tears streamed down his face as he forced himself to move, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't dare look at her. The path ahead was barely visible, but he focused on the stones, counting each one as he passed. Behind him, the voice grew more desperate, more distorted. It wasn't just the woman anymore. Other voices joined in, all calling his name. Some sounded familiar. Others didn't. Nathan's legs felt like they were made of lead, but he didn't stop. The voices faded as he stumbled into another clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward. Carved into its trunk was a single word: "Run." A low growl rumbled from the shadows. Nathan didn't hesitate. He ran. The word on the tree, "Run," seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the grooves glowing faintly in the dim light. Nathan obeyed without question, his muscles burning as he sprinted deeper into the forest. The bell's ominous chime grew fainter, but the air around him remained thick with menace, the atmosphere crackling with unseen tension. His foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling into the mud. Pain flared in his knees and palms as he scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. The rifle slipped from his grip, but there was no time to retrieve it. Shadows shifted in his peripheral vision, moving unnaturally fast, their presence prickling his skin like static electricity. Ahead, the faintest hint of light peeked through the trees. He focused on it, willing his legs to move faster despite the protest of his battered body. The ground beneath him turned from muddy earth to gravel, and soon he found himself on another path, this one marked with glowing blue stones. He slowed, his chest heaving. The eerie quiet of the forest was replaced by a faint hum, rhythmic and unsettling. Each step he took on the glowing path seemed to amplify the sound. He glanced over his shoulder, his instincts screaming that he was being followed. The shadows that had trailed him before were gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint whispers, unintelligible and disjointed, carried on the wind. As he moved forward, they became clearer, words forming from the chaos. "Why do you run, Nathan?" one voice asked, soft and almost amused. "You can't escape," another hissed, venomous and mocking. He clenched his fists, refusing to acknowledge them. Don't respond if they call your name. The woman's warning rang in his ears like a mantra. The path veered sharply to the right, leading to another clearing. In its center stood an ancient stone well, its structure crumbling with age. Despite its dilapidated appearance, the well exuded an unnatural energy, the air around it shimmering like heat waves. Nathan hesitated. The blue stones led directly to the well, their glow intensifying as they neared its base. The hum that had been growing louder was now a deafening drone. He wanted to turn back to find another route, but the forest behind him was no longer an option. He could feel it, something waiting just beyond the tree-line, its patience wearing thin. Cautiously he approached the well, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he drew closer, he noticed strange carvings etched into the stones, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly. The hum grew louder, and he clapped his hands over his ears, trying to drown it out. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Nathan lowered his hands slowly, his ears ringing. He peered over the edge of the well, expecting darkness, but instead found a faint light emanating from within. "Nathan?" The voice made him recoil, his foot slipping on the edge of the well. He caught himself just in time, his heart pounding. This voice wasn't like the others. It wasn't mocking or malicious. It was familiar, comforting. "Nathan, it's me." His breath caught. It was his sister's voice. He staggered back, shaking his head. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not real. Please," the voice pleaded, trembling with emotion. "I'm trapped. You have to help me." Tears blurred his vision as he stepped away from the well. It's not her. It can't be her, but the voice was so convincing, so desperate. "Nathan," it said again, softer this time. "You left me. Don't leave me again." He clenched his fists, trying to block it out, but the words burrowed into his mind. Images of his sister flashed before him. Her smile, her laugh, the way she'd looked the last time he'd seen her. "Nathan?" The voice snapped him out of his thoughts, louder and more urgent. It was followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. The bell. A shadow passed over him, its presence palpable. He turned slowly, and the breath caught in his throat. It was her. Or at least it looked like her. She stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, her hair matted and her clothes torn. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with something he couldn't quite place. "Help me," she said, stepping closer. "No," he whispered, backing away. "Please, Nathan," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't leave me again. The rules. Never respond if they call your name. He closed his eyes, trying to shut her out. "You're not real," he muttered under his breath. "You're not real." When he opened his eyes, she was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the well and the path of blue stones. Nathan spun around, his eyes darting across the room. The statues seemed to be watching him, their empty eyes boring into his soul. The voice came again, louder this time. "The price must be paid." "What price?" Nathan shouted, his voice trembling. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight. Shadows began to move along the walls, coalescing into a humanoid form. The figure stepped forward, its features obscured by the darkness. To take the blade is to seal your fate, the figure said, its voice echoing like a chorus. But without it, you will not survive what comes next. Nathan hesitated, his eyes flicking between the dagger and the shadowy figure. Every instinct told him to leave, to run, but he knew there was no going back. The creatures in the forest, the thing on the bridge, they were nothing compared to what awaited him beyond this chamber. With trembling hands he reached for the dagger. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, the room erupted in light. The symbols on the blade flared to life, and the box in his other hand disintegrated into ash. The shadowy figure let out an inhuman scream, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke. The light faded, and Nathan was alone again. The dagger felt heavy in his hand, its power thrumming through his veins. The chamber began to shake, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. A new path opened behind the pedestal, a narrow corridor carved into the stone. Nathan took a deep breath, clutching the dagger tightly. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. He stepped into the corridor, the walls closing in around him as the chamber collapsed behind him. The only way forward was into the unknown. The dagger's weight in Nathan's hand was more than physical. It carried with it an unseen burden, a promise of violence and desperation. The corridor he stepped into was suffocatingly narrow, forcing him to walk sideways in places. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, as though the walls themselves bled. His footsteps echoed ominously, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence that followed. The glow of the dagger offered the only light, casting flickering shadows on the rough stone walls. He kept moving, his grip on the hilt tightening with every step. The path twisted and turned erratically, as if designed to confuse and disorient anyone who dared to tread it. After what felt like hours, the narrow passage widened abruptly, opening into a cavernous space. The air here was colder, the dampness replaced by a biting chill that seemed to seep into Nathan's bones. The faint hum he had heard earlier returned, louder now, reverberating through the cavern like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The cavern's floor was uneven, a jagged mosaic of cracked stone and pools of stagnant water. At its center was a circular pit, its edges lined with ancient runes that glowed faintly. Above it, suspended by chains that vanished into the darkness above, hung a massive iron cage. Inside the cage was a figure, a man or at least something that resembled one. His gaunt form was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, piercing and unblinking. "You've come far," the figure rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But every step you've taken has led you closer to your end." Nathan's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The figure's lips curled into a grim smile. "A question better left unasked. You hold the dagger and now you hold the choice." Nathan took a step closer, the dagger's glow intensifying as he neared the pit. The runes around its edge flared brighter, pulsing in time with the hum that filled the cavern. "What choice?" he demanded. The man, or whatever he was, laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The dagger is a key. It can open the path forward or it can seal it forever. But the price will be steep." "What price?" "Blood." The figure's voice dropped to a whisper, almost lost in the cavern's echo. "Yours or theirs?" Before Nathan could respond, the cavern shook violently. The chains holding the cage rattled, and the figure let out a guttural cry, his body convulsing as if in pain. Shadows began to pour from the walls, coalescing into monstrous forms that prowled at the edges of the pit. Their eyes glowed with malevolence, and their growls reverberated through the cavern. Nathan's heart raced as he gripped the dagger tightly. The shadows circled him, their movements predatory and deliberate. The figure in the cage screamed again, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "The choice must be made. Do it now before they consume you." Panic surged through Nathan as the shadows closed in. He glanced at the dagger, its blade shimmering with an unnatural light. The pit before him seemed to pulse, the runes around its edge glowing brighter with every second. He didn't understand what he was supposed to do, but the urgency in the figure's voice left no room for hesitation. Nathan stepped to the edge of the pit, the dagger held aloft. The shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for him. Without thinking, he plunged the dagger into the nearest room. The blade sank into the stone as if it were flesh, and the cavern erupted in light. A deafening roar filled the air as the shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating under the intense glow. The chains holding the cage snapped, and the figure within plummeted into the pit. Nathan staggered back, shielding his eyes as the light grew blinding. When the light finally faded, the cavern was silent. The pit was gone, replaced by a smooth expanse of stone. The dagger lay at Nathan's feet, its glow dim and lifeless. He picked it up hesitantly, its weight feeling different now, heavier, almost reluctant. A new path had opened on the far side of the cavern, its entrance marked by more glowing runes. Nathan took a deep breath, his body trembling. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back. The new path was narrow and claustrophobic, the air thick with the scent of decay. Nathan's steps were slow and cautious, his every sense on high alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. As he moved deeper, the walls began to change. What had been rough stone was now smooth and polished, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under the dagger's faint light. Faces stared back at him from the walls, their expressions twisted in agony and terror. Nathan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep moving. The path led to another chamber, smaller than the last but no less ominous. In its center was a pedestal, identical to the one where he had found the dagger. This time, however, the object on the pedestal was not a weapon. It was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in the same shifting symbols as the dagger. The hum returned, louder than ever, as Nathan approached the pedestal. The box seemed to pulse with its own energy, and the dagger in his hand vibrated in response. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave it alone. "Take it," a voice whispered, soft and insidious. It wasn't like the voice from the cage. This one was different, more intimate. It felt like it was coming from inside his own mind. Nathan shook his head, trying to block it out. "No. I've had enough of your games." The voice chuckled, a sound that made his skin crawl. "You've already chosen, Nathan. There's no going back now." Against his better judgment, he reached for the box. The moment his fingers touched it, the chamber plunged into darkness. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and the carvings on the walls began to glow, their faces contorting in pain. Nathan clutched the box tightly as the ground beneath him trembled. The dagger's glow flared, illuminating the chamber just enough for him to see the walls closing in. Panic surged through him as he searched for an escape, but the path he had entered through was gone. A new opening appeared on the far side of the chamber, its edges jagged and unnatural. The roar subsided, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Nathan's spine. Whatever was waiting for him on the other side, it was worse than anything he had faced so far. Nathan took a deep breath, steeling himself. The box in his hand seemed to pulse reassuringly, as if urging him forward. He stepped through the opening, the darkness swallowing him whole. The new corridor was unlike anything he had seen before. The walls were alive, pulsating with a sickly green light. The floor beneath him squelched with every step, as though he were walking on flesh. The air was thick and suffocating, each breath a struggle. Nathan's grip on the dagger tightened as he moved forward, the box held securely under his arm. The growling grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shadows darted in and out of his vision, their forms too fast to make out. Finally, the corridor opened into a massive chamber, its walls lined with pulsating veins of light. At its center was a massive altar, and standing before it was a figure cloaked in darkness. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. "Nathan," it said, its voice a chilling echo of his own. "You've done well to come this far. But the true test is yet to come." The figure raised a hand, and the altar began to glow. The box in Nathan's hands vibrated violently, its pulse syncing with the altar's light. The dagger in his other hand grew warm, its blade shimmering with energy. "The choice is yours," the figure said, its eyes gleaming with malice. "The box or the blade. One will grant you freedom. The other will bind you here forever." Nathan's heart pounded as he stared at the figure, the altar, and the two objects in his hands. The walls of the chamber pulsed faster, the veins of light threatening to burst. Time was running out. He had to decide. Nathan's breathing was shallow, his chest tightening with every pulse of the dagger and the box. The figure standing before the altar, the mirror of himself, yet distorted, alien, watched him with an unnerving stillness. The chamber seemed to throb in anticipation, each vein of light in the walls pulsating in a rhythm that matched his own rapid heartbeat. "The box or the blade," the figure repeated, its voice dripping with a sinister calm. Your fate hangs on this choice. Nathan's mind raced, trying to parse the meaning of the choice. The dagger was his lifeline, the only weapon that had brought him this far. Its weight in his hand felt solid, comforting. The box, however, was an enigma, a pulsating artifact that seemed to hum with untapped power. What happens if I choose wrong? Nathan asked, his voice trembling. The figure smirked. Wrong? There is no wrong choice, only consequences. But you've already seen the shadows, the creatures. You know the cost of hesitation. The chamber trembled slightly, a deep groan reverberating through its fleshy walls. A low growl echoed from somewhere behind him, and Nathan spun around, catching sight of shifting forms in the darkness. The shadows were returning, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Decide, the figure urged, its tone turning sharp. Or they will decide for you. Nathan's grip on the dagger tightened as he looked between the blade and the box. One had protected him. The other promised something undefined but potent. He thought back to everything he'd endured, the forest, the bridge, the cavern, the caged man's cryptic warnings. He turned to the figure. Tell me one thing, he said, his voice firmer. If I choose the blade, what do I lose? The figure's smirk faded, replaced by something more solemn. Yourself. Nathan's stomach twisted. And the box? The world, the figure replied. The chamber shuddered violently, the light in the veins dimming and flaring erratically. The shadows were closer now, their forms taking shape, grotesque amalgamations of limbs and faces twisted by malice. Their growls grew louder, more insistent. Nathan had no time left. He raised the dagger, its blade glinting in the eerie green light. Then he looked at the box, its symbols writhing as if alive. The hum grew deafening, resonating through his very bones. In a single motion, Nathan hurled the box onto the altar. The reaction was immediate. The box shattered on impact, a blinding light exploding from its core. The force of the blast knocked Nathan off his feet, sending him sprawling across the chamber floor. A deafening roar filled the air as the walls seemed to convulse, the veins of light bursting and flooding the room with an otherworldly glow. The shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating in the intense light. The figure by the altar let out a guttural scream, its body flickering like a dying flame. Nathan shielded his eyes, his ears ringing from the cacophony. When the light finally subsided, the chamber was unrecognizable. The walls were no longer pulsing with veins of light. They were smooth and cold, like polished obsidian. The altar stood intact, but the figure was gone. In its place was a swirling vortex of black and white energy, suspended above the altar like a gateway. Nathan pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the blast. The dagger was still in his hand, its blade now glowing faintly. He approached the vortex cautiously, its pull both terrifying and mesmerizing. A voice echoed from the void, deep and resonant. You have chosen the path of sacrifice. Step forward and seal your destiny. Nathan hesitated. What does that mean? What happens if I go through? The voice didn't answer, but the pull of the vortex grew stronger. The dagger in his hand vibrated, its glow intensifying as if urging him forward. Behind him, the shadows began to reform, their remnants coalescing into new shapes. They were slower now, weaker but still dangerous. He didn't have much time. Taking a deep breath, Nathan stepped onto the altar. The vortex's energy wrapped around him, cold and searing all at once. As he moved closer, the dagger's glow turned blinding, and he felt a surge of power course through his veins. With one final step, he plunged into the vortex. Nathan awoke to darkness. The air was thick and suffocating, and the ground beneath him was soft, almost spongy. He groaned, his body aching as he pushed himself upright. The dagger was still in his hand, its glow dim but steady. He looked around, but there was nothing, just an endless expanse of blackness. The hum from the box was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a weight. Where am I? He muttered, his voice barely a whisper. You are nowhere, a voice replied. It wasn't the figure from the chamber, but something else, something ancient and vast. Nathan turned, but there was no source for the voice. What do you mean, nowhere? What is this place? It is the space between, the voice said. The cost of your choice. What cost? Nathan demanded. I destroyed the box. I stopped whatever was trying to break free. The voice chuckled, a low, ominous sound. Did you? Or did you merely exchange one prison for another? Nathan's blood ran cold. What are you saying? The dagger you hold is not a weapon. It is a chain. And you, Nathan, are now its keeper. The darkness around him began to shift, shapes emerging from the void. They were the shadows, but now they were tethered to him, their movements slow and deliberate. The dagger pulsed in his hand, and he realized with horror that he could feel them, each one, a presence bound to his very being. No, he whispered, shaking his head. This can't be happening. You have saved your world, the voice said, its tone almost mocking. But every salvation comes at a cost. You are now the warden of the darkness, bound to keep it contained for all eternity. Nathan sank to his knees, the weight of the dagger unbearable. The shadows circled him, their forms flickering like dying embers. He had made his choice, and now he would pay the price. As the void closed in around him, he could only hope that his sacrifice had been worth it. As the darkness pressed in around him, suffocating every inch of space, Nathan's mind spiraled. His limbs felt heavy, as though they were bound by invisible chains, the weight of the dagger in his hand a constant reminder of the decision he'd made, the choice that had led him here, to this place of eternal darkness and torment. The void seemed to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of black nothingness where no light could reach. The hum of the dagger, which had once been a comforting presence, now thrummed with an alien energy, vibrating through his very soul. The shadows had become his constant companions, their forms flickering and shifting at the edges of his vision, as though they were waiting for something. For him to fail. For him to slip, even for a moment, and allow them to break free. The pull of the dagger was undeniable, and with every beat of his heart, the energy within the void seemed to pulse in response, a twisted synchronization that sent shivers through his bones. He looked down at the dagger, its faint glow a beacon in the vast darkness, but it was no longer the comforting weapon he had once relied on. Now it was something more, something darker, far beyond his understanding. The blade was a chain, an anchor to something much older, much more powerful than anything he had encountered in his journey. Its hum had become a relentless reminder of the price he had paid, the cost of his choice. He was its keeper, bound to it for eternity. The shadows around him began to move with purpose, their forms now distinct, no longer the formless, ethereal creatures that had once lurked at the edges of his sight. They were solid now, their grotesque, twisted faces flickering like dying embers, their limbs extending into unnatural shapes as if reaching out for him. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and Nathan could feel their presence growing stronger, more real with each passing moment. They were drawn to him, tethered to him by the dagger, his curse and his prison. No, he whispered, shaking his head as though to deny the reality that was unfolding before him. This can't be real. I stopped them. I stopped it. But the voice, deep and resonant, responded from the depths of the void, the sound reverberating through his very being. You didn't stop anything, Nathan. You only exchanged one prison for another. The darkness you thought you sealed away is now a part of you, and you are bound to it. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the voice's words sank in. He had thought he was saving the world, that by destroying the box, he had stopped whatever monstrous force had been waiting to break free. But now he understood. The true horror wasn't the creature or the forces he had fought. The true horror was the realization that he had unwittingly embraced a far greater darkness. You have sealed yourself in this place, Nathan, the voice continued, its tone cold and detached, as though it were recounting a simple truth. You are now the warden of all that lies within this void. The darkness, the shadows, they are yours to command, to contain. But you will never be free. Not now. Not ever. He closed his eyes, his mind reeling from the enormity of his situation. He had no choice. The dagger pulsed in his hand, and the shadows closed in on him, their grotesque forms brushing against him as though they were testing the limits of the chains that bound them to him. The weight of the responsibility crushed him, a weight so immense he could barely breathe beneath its force. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with life, its very nature alive and aware, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the pressure on his chest, the suffocating grip of the void tightening around him. The shadows were no longer simply lingering in the background. They were here with him, a constant presence, demanding his attention, demanding his submission. He could feel their cold, malevolent gaze, their insatiable hunger. They were waiting for him to falter, to give in, to release the grip on the dagger, even for a moment. But he knew he couldn't. If he did, if he allowed even the smallest crack in his resolve, the shadows would flood back, more powerful than ever, and he would lose what little control he had over them. The hum of the dagger grew louder, a deep, resonating sound that vibrated through the air. It was a song of power, a song of imprisonment, and Nathan was its only audience. With every heartbeat, the energy within him surged, as though the blade itself was feeding off his fear, his desperation. He could feel it, a dark energy flowing through his veins, twisting with every breath he took, until it was as if the very fabric of his being was becoming one with the dagger, becoming one with the shadows. He fell to his knees, his grip tightening on the dagger as if he could somehow fight against the pull of its power. But it was futile. There was no escape. There was no release. He was the keeper now, the warden, the guardian of this place between worlds, this realm of shadows and voids, where nothing ever truly lived or died. His thoughts turned to the world he had left behind, the world that would continue without him, unaware of the price he had paid. He had done what he thought was right, he had made the hard choice, the sacrifice. But now, in the suffocating silence of the void, he could only wonder if it had been worth it. Was the world truly saved, or had he simply doomed them all to a fate worse than death? The shadows circled him, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they too were waiting for something. Nathan could feel their presence, each one a dark, twisted version of his own fears, regrets, and failures. They were reflections of him, manifestations of his inner darkness, and they were now bound to him for eternity. He was no longer Nathan, the man who had fought through the horrors of the forest, the bridge, the cavern. He was something else, something far more terrifying. He was the warden of the darkness. The voice spoke again, but this time there was no mockery, no derision. Only a final, inevitable truth. You have sealed your fate, Nathan. And now you will remain here. Forever. As the last remnants of his strength drained away, Nathan could feel the shadows closing in, their cold touch overwhelming him. The void seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, each beat a reminder of the curse that had been laid upon him. And as he finally let go, surrendering to the darkness, his last thought was a question that would never be answered. Had the world truly been saved? Or had he simply condemned it all over again? Story 3. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the rusted iron gate, the creaking sound cutting through the stillness of the cold night. The mansion loomed ahead, cloaked in shadows, its towering silhouette jagged against the silver light of a waxing moon. The air was unnaturally still, as though the entire estate was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. He hesitated, a gnawing unease creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the mansion's decayed grandeur that unsettled him, but the inexplicable sense that he was being watched. He glanced back at the long, winding road he'd driven down moments ago, now swallowed entirely by darkness. There was no going back. The house was his now. He had to go inside. Ethan pushed the gate open, its hinges screaming in protest. Each step toward the mansion felt heavier than the last, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't remember the last time he'd felt this way, his heartbeat erratic, his breath shallow. He told himself it was just nerves. After all, inheriting a massive estate out of the blue from a relative he'd never even heard of was enough to throw anyone off balance. The front door was massive, carved from dark oak and adorned with a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a snarling wolf. He lifted it and let it fall. The resulting thud echoed like a gunshot, and the sound lingered, bouncing off unseen corners inside. When no one answered, he tried the knob. The door creaked open on its own, the darkness beyond seeming to welcome him inside. He stepped over the threshold, feeling an immediate drop in temperature. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang that reminded him of rust or blood. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and insignificant in the cavernous space. No response. The entryway was vast, with high vaulted ceilings and a grand staircase that spiraled upward into the shadows. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed for what seemed like years. A faint scratching noise made him freeze, his eyes darting toward the source. a rat scuttling across the floor, disappearing into the darkness. He exhaled, relieved. But as he took another step, the floor beneath him groaned loudly, almost as if in warning. He turned back toward the door, but it was already closing behind him, the soft thud reverberating like a final sentence. He was alone. The letter he'd received earlier that week replayed in his mind. It had been typed on aged parchment, the edges brittle and frayed. The words had been formal, almost cold. To Ethan Hawthorne, sole heir to the Hawthorne estate. Your presence is required at the Hawthorne Manor to finalize your inheritance. The house and its contents are now yours. Welcome home. The letter had come with no contact information, no name or signature. Just that strange, ominous message. His friends had laughed it off, suggesting it was some elaborate scam or prank, but Ethan's curiosity had gotten the better of him. Now, standing in the middle of this decaying monstrosity, he wasn't so sure it had been worth the trip. He started exploring, his footsteps echoing with each hesitant step. The mansion seemed alive, the wooden beams groaning softly, the faint whisper of the wind snaking through the cracks. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He found the living room first. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened and cold. Above it hung a portrait, the paint cracked and peeling with age. It depicted a stern-looking man with sharp, angular features and piercing blue eyes. Ethan couldn't help but feel that those eyes were following him, no matter where he moved in the room. A sudden clattering sound upstairs made him jump. His heart thundered as he strained to listen. It sounded like footsteps, quick, shuffling, and deliberate. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house had animals, rats, raccoons, or stray cats. But deep down, he knew those footsteps were too heavy to belong to any animal. "Hello?" he called again, his voice quivering. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed in on him, suffocating and deafening. Ethan considered turning back, leaving the house entirely, but something held him in place. Was it stubbornness? Curiosity? Or was it the faint, almost imperceptible pull of something he couldn't quite explain? He decided to investigate. The staircase creaked beneath his weight as he ascended, each step feeling like a defiance of some unspoken rule. The second floor was even darker than the first, the shadows pooling in the corners, thick and impenetrable. The air was colder here, and that metallic tang was stronger, making his stomach churn. As he moved down the hallway, he noticed that the doors on either side were slightly ajar, each room beyond shrouded in darkness. He resisted the urge to look inside, keeping his focus on the end of the corridor, where the noise had originated. When he reached the final door, he hesitated. It was closed, unlike the others, and there was something about it that felt wrong. The doorknob was tarnished, its surface etched with strange, intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift under his gaze. He felt a sudden chill, like icy fingers trailing down his spine. Summoning his courage, he reached out and turned the knob. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. The furniture was ornate, the bed neatly made, and the air lacked the stale, musty quality of the rest of the house. But it was the object in the center of the room that caught his attention. A small wooden table with a single item resting on it. A journal. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. The journal's cover was black leather, worn and cracked, with the same strange symbols embossed on it. He hesitated before picking it up, the leather cold against his fingers. When he opened it, the first page was blank. So was the second, and the third. It wasn't until he reached the fourth page that he saw something. Writing. The ink was dark and fresh, as though it had just been written moments ago. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, almost frantic. Read. Do not trust it. It watches. Always. Ethan's breath hitched. He flipped to the next page, but it was blank again. He closed the journal, his mind racing. Who had written that? And what did they mean by it? A soft creak behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The room was empty, or so it seemed. But the shadows in the corners seemed darker now, shifting almost imperceptibly. And then he saw it, just for a moment. A pair of eyes, gleaming faintly in the darkness, staring right at him. He dropped the journal, his pulse racing, and backed away toward the door. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched. He bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. But the moment of relief was short-lived. From behind the door he heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Ethan? Ethan?" Ethan stumbled back from the door, his breath hitching. That voice, deep, raspy, and impossibly close, echoed in his ears. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. His fingers fumbled against the banister as he turned to flee down the hallway, the oppressive silence of the mansion closing in on him with every step. But then the whisper came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Don't leave." Ethan froze mid-step. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would echo off the walls. The voice wasn't hostile. It was desperate, almost mournful. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, he found himself glancing back toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. He didn't move toward it. He couldn't. Instead, he forced himself to back away, his eyes fixed on the door until he turned the corner and descended the stairs 2 at a time. The mansion seemed to breathe around him. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the ancient walls felt alive, as though the house itself was aware of his presence. By the time he reached the bottom of the stairs, he was drenched in sweat despite the icy chill that permeated the air. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he swiped the screen. No signal. Of course there wasn't. Why would there be in a place like this? He shoved it back into his pocket and made his way toward the front door. The idea of braving the dark countryside on foot didn't seem half as terrifying as staying in this cursed house for another second. He grasped the doorknob and twisted. It didn't budge. "Come on," he muttered, yanking harder. The knob felt cold, unnaturally so, and refused to turn. He tried shoving the door, slamming his shoulder into it, but it was as though the wood had fused with the frame. Panic began to set in, his breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. He tried the nearby windows next, but they wouldn't open either. Even the glass, coated with decades of grime, felt as solid as stone under his fists. He was trapped. Ethan leaned against the wall, his head spinning. "Think," he told himself. "There has to be another way out." He glanced toward the kitchen. Maybe there was a back door. He hurried toward it, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty space. The kitchen was just as decayed as the rest of the house, its countertops coated in a thick layer of dust, its appliances relics from another era. He spotted a door at the far end and rushed to it, hope flaring briefly in his chest. But the moment he reached it, that hope was extinguished. The door was sealed shut just like the front. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cold wood, his hands clenched into fists. "What the hell is happening here?" he whispered. The sound of something shuffling behind him made him whirl around. The kitchen was empty, or so it seemed at first. His eyes scanned the shadows, his pulse hammering in his ears. And then he saw it, a faint outline in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Moved. Ethan's breath caught as the shape stepped closer, resolving into a figure. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side as though the neck had been broken, and its eyes, dark, hollow voids that seemed to pull the light from the room, fixed on him. He stumbled back, his hands scrambling for anything to defend himself with. His fingers closed around a rusty knife from the counter, and he held it up, his grip shaky. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its footsteps eerily silent despite the creaky floorboards. Ethan's back hit the door, and he realized there was nowhere left to go. He tightened his grip on the knife, ready to strike, but then the figure stopped abruptly, just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was being dragged across shards of glass, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's mind reeled. "Who? What are you?" he managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head further, the motion grotesque and unnatural. "It doesn't matter. You're his now." "Whose?" Ethan demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed past him, toward the door he had come through. Ethan turned his head slightly, following the gesture, but saw nothing but the dark hallway beyond. When he looked back, the figure was gone. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. He sank to the floor, clutching the knife like a lifeline. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was he losing his mind? Or was there something far more sinister at work in this house? His eyes fell on the journal, still clutched in his other hand. He didn't remember picking it up, but there it was, the worn leather cover cool against his skin. He opened it again, flipping to the page with the frantic warning. Do not trust it. It watches. Always. He turned the page, hoping for more answers. This time there was writing. New writing. Leave the house before midnight. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands frozen at a time long past. He checked his phone instead. The screen glowed faintly, revealing the time, 11:48 p.m. 12 minutes. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over him. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He didn't know how or why, but he believed the warning. He had to get out of the house, and he had to do it now. But as he turned to leave the kitchen, something cold and invisible brushed against his arm. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The air grew heavier, and the faint sound of whispers filled the room, unintelligible but growing louder by the second. Then the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was suffocating, as though Ethan had been plunged into a vast, lightless ocean. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel anything but the frantic pounding of his own heart. His fingers clutched the journal like a lifeline, the leather binding digging into his palms. Then out of the void a voice emerged, not the raspy, guttural tones he'd heard before, but something smooth, calm, and far more chilling. Did you think you could run? Ethan froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, pressing against his skull. You brought yourself here, it continued, each word slow and deliberate. Your greed. Your desperation. You opened the door. I didn't, Ethan's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. I didn't want any of this. I was tricked. The voice chuckled, low and mocking. You're all the same. Always blaming something else. But this place, it knows the truth. A faint light flickered in the distance, illuminating a sliver of the space around him. Ethan turned toward it, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was back, or something worse. Its form was unstable, shifting and flickering as though it were made of shadows that couldn't quite hold their shape. Its face was still a void, a swirling blackness that seemed to draw Ethan closer the longer he stared at it. I don't belong here, Ethan whispered, more to himself than anything else. The figure tilted its head. And yet here you are. The light expanded, revealing the room around him, or what was left of it. The bookshelves had collapsed, their contents scattered across the floor. The chandelier hung by a single chain, its broken crystals casting fractured beams of light. But the journal's pedestal remained untouched, standing in the center of the chaos like an anchor. Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. He had to get out, but how? The doors were gone, the walls were closing in, and the figure was blocking his only path. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long skeletal arm and pointed at the journal in Ethan's hands. He looked down at it, his stomach twisting. The pages were glowing faintly now, their symbols shifting and writhing as though alive. He flipped to the next page, hoping for some kind of answer, but the text made his blood run cold. Give it back or he will take you. Give it back? Ethan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. What does that mean? The figure stepped closer, its movements eerily fluid. Ethan stumbled back, nearly dropping the journal. He could feel the air around him growing colder, heavier, as though the room itself was closing in. And then he understood. The journal. It wasn't just a book, it was a key. A key that had opened whatever door had brought him here. And now, the house, or whatever force controlled it, wanted it back. But what would happen if he gave it up? Ethan's mind raced. If the journal was the key, maybe it was also his way out. Maybe it held the answers he needed. But the warning on the page, or he will take you, echoed in his mind like a death knell. The figure took another step forward, its arm still outstretched. Ethan's fingers tightened around the journal. No, he said, his voice trembling but firm. I'm not giving it to you. The room seemed to shudder at his words, the walls groaning as the light flickered and dimmed. The figure let out a low, inhuman growl, its void-like face twisting into something resembling a snarl. You've made your choice, the voice said, colder now, devoid of the mockery it had carried before. Suddenly, the floor beneath Ethan's feet gave way. He screamed as he plunged into the darkness, the journal slipping from his grasp. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on a cold, hard surface. The air was thick and stifling, and the faint sound of whispers filled the space around him. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, and looked around. He was in a small, windowless room, the walls made of rough stone. A single door stood on the far side, its surface etched with the same strange symbols that had filled the journal. The book itself lay nearby, its pages open and glowing faintly. Ethan crawled toward it, his hands trembling. As he reached for it, the whispers grew louder, forming words he could almost understand. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the cover. And then the door creaked open. He turned sharply, his heart leaping into his throat. The figure was there again, but this time it was different. It was no longer a shadowy, shifting form. It was solid, its grotesque features fully visible. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan grabbed the journal and scrambled to his feet, holding it out like a shield. "Stay back," he shouted. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly. Then it spoke, its voice low and echoing. "You cannot escape. Not without sacrifice." "What do you mean?" Ethan demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it pointed to the journal. Ethan looked down at it, his mind racing. The symbols on the page seemed to shift, forming a single word: choose. "What am I supposed to choose?" he asked, his voice breaking. But the figure didn't answer. It simply waited, its hollow gaze fixed on him. Ethan's thoughts spiraled. If he gave up the journal, he might save himself. But what would he unleash? And if he kept it, what would happen to him? The whispers grew louder, the room shaking as the walls seemed to close in. Time was running out. Ethan's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession as he stared at the grotesque figure before him. Its hollow eyes were voids, swallowing what little courage he had left. The word choose glowed ominously on the journal's pages, demanding an answer he wasn't ready to give. "What happens if I don't choose?" Ethan's voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. The figure's expression didn't change, but the whispers in the room grew louder, as if responding to his question. They overlapped in a cacophony of words he couldn't understand, but their intent was clear. No choice meant no escape. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing through every possibility. "I need more time," he shouted, clutching the journal tighter. The figure's skeletal hand rose, pointing once again toward the book. Its voice was calm, devoid of the growling malice it had carried earlier. "Time is the luxury of the ignorant. You chose the moment you stepped inside." Ethan's stomach churned. The whispers were deafening now, like thousands of voices screaming for his attention. His vision blurred as he looked down at the journal again, flipping through its pages in desperation. Each page displayed new text, but the meanings were cryptic, written in symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves as he stared. His hands trembled as he turned to the last page. This time the message was clear. "The book holds your life. The house holds your soul." "What does that mean?" Ethan demanded, his voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer, the air around it growing colder. Ethan's fingers tightened around the journal, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had to act. The room began to shift again, the stone walls warping and pulsing like they were alive. The floor beneath Ethan's feet cracked, thin fissures spreading out in jagged patterns. From somewhere deep below, a low, guttural roar reverberated, shaking the very foundation of the space. Ethan's knees buckled, but he steadied himself. "Fine," he yelled, his voice raw with desperation. "You want me to choose? Then tell me, what happens if I give it back?" The figure's void-like gaze seemed to pierce through him. "The book will return to its keeper. And you will remain." Ethan's breath hitched. "Remain? Here. In this house." The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The truth was clear in the growing shadows that crept closer with every passing second. "And if I don't give it back?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head. "Then you will carry its curse. A life bound to its power. A fate worse than death." Ethan's mind spun. Neither option seemed survivable. But he didn't have time to hesitate. The cracks in the floor widened, and the whispers turned into ear-piercing screams. "Think, Ethan," he muttered to himself, pacing in a tight circle. "There has to be another way." The journal pulsed in his hands as if alive. He stared at it, the symbols glowing brighter and shifting faster. Something about the movement caught his attention, a pattern hidden among the chaos. Ethan squinted, focusing on the swirling shapes. They were spelling something. Take the pen. A chill ran down his spine. He flipped the journal to its first page, and there it was. A single pen nestled in a groove along the spine of the book. He hadn't noticed it before. It was sleek and black, its surface etched with faint, glowing lines. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over it. "What happens if I use this?" he asked, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve into the shadows, its form scattering like smoke caught in a breeze. The whispers stopped. The room fell silent. Ethan looked back at the journal, the pen now glowing faintly in its slot. He didn't have a choice, he had to take the risk. He grabbed the pen. The moment his fingers touched it, the room erupted in light. Ethan staggered back, shielding his eyes as the stone walls disintegrated around him. The air crackled with energy, and the floor beneath him seemed to vanish, leaving him suspended in a blinding void. When the light faded, he was somewhere else entirely. The new space was vast and empty, a smooth black surface stretching endlessly in every direction. In the center stood a single object, a mirror, tall and ornate, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them. Ethan approached cautiously, the pen still clutched in his hand. The mirror's surface wasn't reflective. It was dark, almost liquid, rippling as though it were alive. And then his reflection appeared. But it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror was distorted, its features twisted and wrong. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth curved into a sinister smile. "Welcome," it said, its voice a perfect echo of Ethan's own. Ethan stumbled back. What is this?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, mirroring Ethan's movements, and pointed to the journal. Ethan looked down. The book was open in his other hand, its pages blank except for a single line. "Write your ending." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "What does that mean?" The reflection's smile widened. "You hold the pen. You decide. But be warned, every ending has a price." Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the blank page. His mind raced. Could he trust this? Was this truly his way out, or just another trap? The reflection watched him, unblinking. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, forming words that Ethan could now understand. "Write quickly or lose everything." Ethan's grip tightened on the pen as the whispers clawed at his mind, their urgency slicing through his hesitation. His eyes darted between the blank page in the journal and the sinister reflection in the mirror. The figure's smile didn't falter. It was a predator waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. "What am I supposed to write?" Ethan yelled into the void. The reflection's head tilted, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Your story. Your fate. But be careful, words have power here." The whispers grew louder, now blending into a symphony of warnings and temptations. "Write the truth. Write a lie. Write your escape. Write your doom." Ethan shook his head, his breathing ragged. How could he decide? What if he wrote the wrong thing? He glanced at the pen, its surface pulsating with a faint, eerie glow. The weight of it in his hand felt unnatural, as though it were alive and waiting for his command. His stomach churned. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, his voice cracking. The reflection's smile vanished, replaced by a look of hollow impatience. It raised its hand again, this time pointing directly at Ethan. "Start where it ends? What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice rising in frustration. "You're not making any sense." The reflection didn't answer. Instead, the surface of the mirror began to ripple violently, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet trembled. Shadows emerged from the darkness, slithering toward him like living vines. The whispers turned into screams. "Right." Ethan's hand moved on its own, the pen pressed against the journal's blank page. His fingers trembled as he scrawled the first words that came to mind. "I want to go home." The moment the words appeared, the shadows recoiled, their movements erratic. The reflection's face twisted into a sneer, and it leaned closer, its voice sharp and venomous. "Foolish boy. Do you think it's that simple?" Ethan's chest tightened, panic surging through him. "Then tell me what to do." But the reflection only laughed, a sound that echoed endlessly in the vast emptiness. The journal's pages began to glow, the words Ethan had written disappearing as new text appeared in their place. "To leave, you must face what you brought with you." The pen in his hand grew heavier, its glow intensifying. Ethan's mind raced. Face what he brought? What had he brought? His memories flashed before him. The dilapidated house, the journal sitting innocuously on the pedestal, the desperate curiosity that had driven him to take it. But there was more. Something deeper. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. Images of his past surfaced unbidden. The choices he had made, the regrets he carried, the people he had hurt in his blind pursuit of answers. And then it hit him. The journal, he whispered. It's not about the house. It's about me. The reflection's expression darkened, its glowing eyes narrowing. Clever boy. But knowing the truth doesn't mean you can escape it. The shadows surged forward again, faster this time. Ethan stumbled back, clutching the journal to his chest. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering to the ground. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The reflection stepped out of the mirror. Ethan's blood turned to ice as the figure emerged, its movements smooth and deliberate. It was no longer just a reflection. It was solid, real, and standing mere feet away. "Every choice you've made has led you here," it said, its voice low and menacing. "This is where your story ends, unless you write a new one." Ethan's gaze darted to the journal, its pages now blank again. He dove for the pen, his fingers closing around it just as the figure lunged. Time seemed to slow as Ethan raised the pen and began to write, the words spilling out in a frantic scrawl. "I banish you. I end this nightmare. I take back my life." The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form convulsing violently. The shadows retreated, their movements wild and chaotic. The ground beneath Ethan's feet steadied and the air grew still. For a brief moment, silence reigned. Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. The figure was gone, and the mirror had shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard glowing faintly before disintegrating into nothingness. The journal lay open in his hands, its pages now filled with strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie light. The pen was gone, its weight no longer burdening him. And then the whispers returned. But this time they were different. Softer. Calmer. "It's not over." Ethan's breath hitched. Before he could react, the journal's pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster until they stopped abruptly. A single line of text appeared, written in blood-red ink. "One more chapter remains." The ground beneath him gave way and he fell into darkness once more. Ethan's screams were swallowed by the void as he plummeted, the journal clutched to his chest like a lifeline. The darkness was suffocating, endless, and cold. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of direction. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall ended. Ethan hit solid ground with a bone-jarring thud. The journal slipped from his grasp, skidding across the smooth, black surface. He groaned, his body aching, and pushed himself to his knees. The space around him was eerily familiar. The same infinite void, the same oppressive silence. But this time he wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They surrounded him, their faces obscured but their presence overwhelming. Each figure held a faintly glowing journal, identical to the one Ethan had carried. "What is this?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. One of the figures stepped forward. Its face was a blur, but its voice was clear and sharp. "The end of the story." Ethan's eyes darted to the journal lying a few feet away. "I didn't write this." "I didn't?" "You wrote every word," the figure interrupted. "Every choice you made, every step you took led you here. This is your story, Ethan. And now it's time to finish it." The other figures began to chant in unison, their voices low and haunting. The words were incomprehensible, but their intent was clear. The journal's pages fluttered open, and a single line of text appeared. "Write the truth or be consumed by the lie." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He reached for the journal, but as his fingers brushed its cover, the space around him shifted. The void transformed into scenes from his past, snapshots of the moments he wished he could forget. There was the day he'd stolen his friend's idea and passed it off as his own, the betrayal etched on their face. There was the argument with his mother, the cruel words he could never take back. There was the night he had broken a promise to someone he loved, choosing selfish ambition over loyalty. Ethan staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stop it. I didn't ask for this." The lead figure stepped closer, its journal glowing brighter. "The house doesn't choose lightly, Ethan. It draws those who carry the weight of their own lies. You wanted answers, but the truth was always within you." "I didn't come here for this," Ethan yelled, his voice cracking. I just wanted to know what was inside. The figure's head tilted. Curiosity may open the door, but guilt keeps it locked. The chanting grew louder, the words now clear and sharp. Write the truth. Write the truth. Ethan's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. The journal burned in his hands, its pages glowing with an intense light. He knew what he had to do, but fear gripped him. If he wrote the truth, would it save him, or destroy him? He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face, and began to write. I am selfish. I am a liar. I have hurt people who didn't deserve it. I have carried this weight for so long, pretending it wasn't mine. But it is. I made these choices. I have to live with them. I want to make it right, if I can. The moment he finished, the journal burst into flames, the fire consuming the pages but leaving his hands unscathed. The figures surrounding him began to fade, their journals disintegrating one by one. The void dissolved, replaced by the familiar sight of the house's grand foyer. Ethan was back where he had started, the pedestal standing empty before him. He staggered to his feet, his legs shaky. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had clung to him now gone. The front door creaked open, revealing the night outside. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the pedestal. The journal was gone, but the memories it had dredged up remained. He took a deep breath and stepped outside. The cool night air hit his face, and he collapsed onto the grass, staring up at the sky. For the first time in years, he felt free. The house loomed behind him, silent and still. Its secrets were its own once more. But Ethan knew he couldn't forget. The truth he had written in the journal wasn't just an escape. It was a beginning. The choices he made from this moment on would define the next chapter of his life. He stood, his resolve firm. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint echo of whispers, a reminder of what he had faced. As he walked away from the house, he whispered to himself, I won't go back. I won't let myself be that person again. And as the house disappeared into the darkness, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Call to action *. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones we're told, they're the ones we tell ourselves. If this story gripped you, if it made you question what you'd do in Ethan's place, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. There are more stories to come, each one daring you to confront your fears and face the unknown. Until next time, keep the lights on.